So, I'm going to move that closer. My apologies for having to sit, but I have to be at the microphone here. Good morning, bienvenue à tous. My name is Jonathan Bankston, and I am the Vice President of the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, CARL, and Chair of CARL's Digital Preservation Working Group, which is a subgroup of CARL's Advancing Research Committee, one of our standing committees, as well as University Librarian at the University of Victoria. Very happy to be here. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka place, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. I must say you all look fantastic out there. I've already taken one panoramic picture of you all, so I hope you don't mind. On behalf of CARL and our partnering organizations, I'd like to welcome you to today's Forum on Digital Preservation in Canada, At-Risk North 2, the sequel to At-Risk North, which was focused on print collections. Sequels sometimes are as good or better than their original films. I hope you enjoy the program we planned for you, and I look forward to hearing your excellent contributions, and this applies, of course, both to the many presenters we have today and all of you in the audience, too. Today is intended to be a participative opportunity to discuss the gaps and opportunities within our collective digital preservation efforts. And there'll be opportunities to discuss with others at your table and report back to the broader group later in the day. As always, there's a bit of housekeeping to keep track of. So the Wi-Fi information is on the cards on your tables. They're a little bit surreptitious, but the little place cards, so you'll find the Wi-Fi. You're invited to tweet about the event using the hashtag @risknorth2. Please, if you haven't done so already, this is a bilingual event, so if you need a microphone or a headset, sorry, they are available at the registration desk, I believe. Please also, through the day, make sure to speak into the mics. This is both for the simultaneous translation that we have, as well as the fact that we're live streaming today's event on the CARL YouTube channel. Yes, CARL has a YouTube channel. So welcome to, where's camera 3? Now, I think actually we've got one camera in the room. Welcome to those of you who are joining us remotely. One of the advantages, of course, of live streaming is that we're archiving this event as well. So you'll be able to watch it later if you want to see the sequel twice. Bathrooms are just behind the registration desk in the corner over there, behind the buffet. Some of you may not yet realize that there are some fairly significant travel issues today in Montreal. There's the Turcotte interchange between here and the airport is apparently being demolished or something. So I know that there are people in the room who are aware of this already. Some may have to leave early. That's of course okay. Those of you who you're hearing this for the first time, you may want to just review, particularly if you're leaving before about 6:30, 7 o'clock tonight. If you have travel arrangements through the airport, I would just check maybe with the hotel front desk to see what the current situation is in getting out to the airport. So we have a very ambitious schedule today, and I'm going to remind all the speakers, and I'm sitting at the front, so if you're not listening to me, then I'm going to, take my vaudeville hook and pull you off the stage, but we're going to keep to time today, so it's a packed schedule. Unfortunately, the CARL president, Donna Byrne-Tyson, can't be here today, but she does send her greetings, and I will attempt to do a good impression of Donna, as well as myself. I just can't do the hair. So I'd like to start by recognizing the important contributions of our presenting organizations for this event, the Canadian Research Knowledge Network, Library and Archives Canada, and the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales du Québec. This event was undertaken, the planning for this several months ago now by the Carl-led multi-stakeholder digital preservation working group, which includes representatives from the Canadian Council of Archives, CRKN, the Council of Prairie and Pacific University Libraries, otherwise known as COPO, Library and Archives Canada, Scholars Portal, OCO, Ontario Council of University Libraries, CARL, and several Canadian research libraries. So if you'll indulge us, I'd just like members of the working group to stand up so we can thank them here in the room. So could members of the Digital Preservation Working Group please stand? Thank you very much. We had a smaller organizing committee of that group for this event, and I'd just like to acknowledge them too. We had Sylvain Belanger, Director General of Preservation, Library and Archives Canada, Corey Davis, Digital Preservation Coordinator of COPO, Susan Hay, Executive Director of CARL, Jeff Harder, Associate University Librarian, University of Alberta, Laura Wilson, Chair of the Canadian Council of Archives, and Lise Bryn, Program Officer at CARL. And you'll see more of Lise later in the day. She's going to take over my MC duties after lunch. So Lise is over here. And this event could not have happened without her help. So just a round of applause, please, for Lise. And finally, I'd like to thank in advance everyone who's presenting today. There's an impressive range of projects and achievements represented, and your contributions and work on our collective digital preservation ecosystem is much appreciated. So now I'd like to invite Maureen Clapperton to say a few words on behalf of our co-presenting organization, BA&Q. She is the Executive Director. Please.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que vous m'entendez bien? Bonjour à tous. Bienvenue à Montréal. Je suis très heureuse que la métropole francophone canadienne ait été choisie pour accueillir la journée d'échange Risque Nord 2, collection numérique en péril, cette année. Jamais dans son histoire, l'humanité n'a eu autant accès à autant d'informations documentant toutes les sphères de l'activité humaine. La mise en ligne et la diffusion de cette mémoire collective sur le web, rendue possible grâce à Internet et aux avancées technologiques, ont modifié de façon fondamentale nos façons de faire et sont devenus des défis stratégiques cruciaux pour toutes les organisations vouées à la préservation et à l'accessibilité des sources informationnelles. Collectivement, comme vous le savez, nous produisons des millions de fichiers équivalents à des milliards d'octets. Ce gigantesque travail permet de donner à des centaines de milliers de documents une seconde vie en les diffusant dans l'univers virtuel. Notre objectif de numérisation du patrimoine documentaire ne doit pas occulter le défi principal auquel toutes nos organisations doivent faire face présentement, soit celui de préserver à long terme cette information. Les organismes voués à la conservation des documents, nos services d'archives, les bibliothèques, les musées, les informaticiens, les fournisseurs de logiciels et les créateurs de documents doivent travailler en étroite collaboration pour s'assurer que les données créées, traitées et diffusées seront conservées adéquatement et demeureront facilement accessibles pour les générations futures. Sans une approche concertée, nous risquons, en tant que collectivité, de manquer notre devoir de transmission ou de passeur à la génération suivante de notre héritage documentaire. C'est grâce à notre volonté, à notre curiosité et à notre capacité d'innover que nous réussirons à atteindre cet objectif de préservation de nos collections. En terminant, permettez-moi de vous dire quelques mots au sujet de Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec. Vous le savez peut-être, pour plusieurs d'entre vous, mais BNQ est le résultat d'un mariage unique entre la Bibliothèque nationale, les Archives nationales et la Grande Bibliothèque du Québec. À l'ère de la société de l'information, alors que la lecture et la transmission des connaissances sont à la base de la prospérité, BNQ participe à l'édification du savoir dans notre société. Dépositaire de la mémoire du Québec par ses collections patrimoniales et ses fonds d'archives, BNQ est aussi la Bibliothèque centrale de Montréal, comme vous le savez, ainsi qu'une bibliothèque virtuelle. Ses rôles d'acquisition, de conservation et de diffusion sont bien connus. Elle déploie également ses services dans 12 édifices ouverts sur tout le territoire du Québec. À ces 12 édifices s'est ajouté récemment la Bibliothèque Saint-Sulpice, que le ministère de la Culture et des Communications et la Ville de Montréal ont confié à notre institution. Il s'agit d'une grande institution assez complexe, comme vous le voyez. Depuis 2006, BNQ se mesure avec brio aux grands défis qui se présentent aux institutions de mémoire, notamment en ce qui concerne le numérique. Le déploiement et l'enrichissement de l'interface BNQ numérique depuis plus de 2 ans donne en effet une visibilité inégalée à de nombreux documents patrimoniaux qui peuvent être consultés partout en tout temps. De toute façon, je vous invite à aller voir notre site web là-dessus. J'ai hâte de vous entendre et d'en savoir plus sur les ressources et les initiatives de collaboration liées à la conservation du numérique qui sont en cours dans vos organisations. Nous aurons aussi l'occasion de vous présenter les réflexions de BNQ sur la conservation pérenne du numérique plus tard aujourd'hui. Je vous remercie et je nous souhaite à tous une excellente journée d'échange. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Mary. So I am very pleased that we can begin the program with a presentation by Clifford Lynch, Director of the Coalition for Networked Information, CNI. Most of us know it's an emerging trend in digital preservation and is a very trusted source on this topic. He's scared the living hell by suggesting concern about protecting the scholarly record from potential attacks to subvert the content of our digital collections and archives. This morning he will speak to us on the challenges of stewardship in the digital age. Please join me in welcoming Cliff.
Okay, is this working? We good? The light on? Now it is. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here today and to see so many colleagues. Broad view of the challenges of preserving the digital world. I really welcome the kind of frame of this meeting as thinking about broad strategies for how we're going to cope with digital collections of various kinds, as opposed to these discussions that we've had for many years that tend to get very tied up in the mechanics of how to preserve are not entirely straightforward, but we have made quite a bit of progress in this area. I think that we are at a time now where we need to really pivot from mechanics to broad strategy. And I hope that my remarks this morning will help a bit with that. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation towards the end. So the place where I want to start is with two ideas that I find helpful in framing the issues here. We have the notion of the scholarly record. This is basically the record of scholarly discovery and the sharing of knowledge. It also incorporates, and we're becoming increasingly explicit about this, much of the evidence upon which those discoveries are based or those arguments are advanced. So, particularly in the digital world now, we see a move from just talking about preserving articles and monographs to preserving articles and monographs and the data sets that underlie the analysis, and then moving beyond just the data sets to also preserving, in some cases, the software that brings those data sets to life, that permits their analysis and reanalysis, and that also documents the specifics of how they were analyzed by the researchers that published results based on them. And we've actually moved even a bit beyond that to a few other things that we historically didn't really think of as parts of the scholarly record. For example, analytic workflows, how various data sets were created, processed, analyzed, and found their way into final results. And in some cases, particularly when you're dealing with complex sensor networks, those workflows may be quite complex and quite important to document independent of the specific bits of software that comprise various steps along the way. A very good example, experimental methods. So if you look at a traditional scientific article, you'll find there's frequently a methods section in there. What the methods section is supposed to do is to give another researcher enough information so that they could reconduct the experiment. In practice, that is almost never true. And the way this is normally done is if you want to reconduct the experiment, you get a postdoc who goes and spends some time in the first researcher's lab and then comes and shows you how to do it. Now we are seeing the use, for example, of videos that are placed on YouTube or other places that really provide much more depth and insight than is possible in a short method section in a scientific article. So we see those as part of the scholarly record too. And the scholarly record is a primary focus of our research libraries. We really cannot do scholarship without that record to build upon. But let me just identify a couple of characteristics of the scholarly record. The first is it's relatively bounded. There are a large but pretty finite number of scholarly journals. We have rough agreement on what constitutes that set. I mean, yes, I'm absolutely prepared to say there are some marginal cases everywhere we can bicker over. We're still trying to understand exactly how much of the underlying data sets we need to keep and for how long, because keeping them in some cases is quite costly. But there is a shared understanding that the integrity and preservation of that fairly finite scholarly record is of essential importance. And in fact, one way we can see this is if you look at the conversations that occurred 10 or 15 years ago, when it became clear that scholarly journals were going to go to electronic-only publication. And basically, the entire community of authors, readers, libraries, and publishers recognized that that was not going to happen until Everybody involved could tell a convincing story about how those works were going to be preserved in digital form. And we saw the emergence of various kinds of deposit agreements. We saw the development of things like portico and locks and clocks, basically a series of infrastructure components that assure that preservation. And there was no real arguing about the importance of that. Publishers, libraries, authors, readers all said, yes, this is important, we must do it. The scholarly record, to at least a first approximation, is really permeated and framed by a set of shared values. We can see bits of pressure. I would point you, for example, at the debates about data sharing, about what the obligations of scholars are to share data, how quickly and with whom, and the issues about credit for reuse of data and those kinds of things. But things are fundamentally around the margin. Now, let me make one other set of points about the scholarly record. One thing that I find very striking in all of our discussions about digital preservation is if I ask the question, well, how well are we doing? Are we doing well enough? If we put more resources into it, could we do better? How much better? Can we measure that? Usually you get blank stares. This is not a topic that people have wanted to undertake. We actually now are starting to get some genuine insight about this in the area of scholarly journals. And I would just bring to your attention the very good work of the Keepers Registry that is based at Edina at the University of Edinburgh and the Keepers Project. What this is basically about is building a registry of which of these preservation services are covering which journals. And you can make some estimates, and admittedly there are some technical problems here, but you can at least make some estimates of the population of journals through things like looking at the number of ISSNs that the national ISSN agencies are issuing. You can compare those against the Keepers Registry, and you can say things like 40% of the scholarly journals that are being published now are being preserved by more than 3 keepers. That's a remarkable advance, and you can look at this year by year. You can look at this by nation, and you can also start at least trying, and there are, again, some formidable technical problems here, to look at issues that many of us, have been worried about, like the strong bias in scholarly publishing to protect the expensive journals that perhaps are least at risk. If you asked me what scientific or scholarly journals I was afraid might disappear tomorrow, I would not say Elsevier journals are on the top of the list. But those are extremely well preserved for various reasons. Elsevier recognizes the importance of preserving them. A keeper can get a lot of content through one agreement with Elsevier in terms of the number of journals covered. And there's agreement that these are important journals. The really tough ones are that very long tail of open access journals coming out of systems and platforms like the Open Journal system. Now, there have been some very important structural advances recently where the Open Journal system has partnered with some of the keepers to make it easier to save those in a fairly straightforward manner. But anyway, my point is, with efforts like the Keepers Registry, we are beginning to get at least some insight into how much progress we're making and where the problems are. And I think one of our big challenges for the decade ahead is to try and think about how we're going to do something similar for data sets and for digital scholarly monographs as we move into that area. But now, let me back off from the scholarly record where I think, while there are plenty of challenges, we're in relatively good shape, and talk about what I really am very scared about, and that's the broader cultural record. You can think about the broad cultural record as encompassing all of the art, communications, preserved human activities, lawmaking, the first drafts of history, an enormous range of materials that documents how we live and think and discuss and the decisions we make today. And all of the material doing that has been brought forward to us from the past. Now, in contrast with the scholarly record, this is an enormous, amorphous thing. The boundaries of it are unclear. We have never preserved it all in human history. We never will preserve it all. It is a record that is infused by a very wide variety of perspectives about how this should be treated. You have things that sit on the boundary between the personal and the public. You have some things that by law need to be preserved, certain kinds of public records. You have artistic products. You have things that are made for the mass marketplace. You have a complicated mix of motivations ranging from communication to commercial gain in these markets. Furthermore, while I would say research libraries and their allies, things like data centers, have been the primary stewards of the scholarly record, for the cultural record, we share responsibility between research libraries, who I believe must be interested in this because this is the evidence that will drive future scholarship, to museums, archives, a variety of new kinds of organizations that have popped up in the 20th century that we put them under the general category of memory organizations, but they don't kind of fit all that comfortably with the traditions of museums, libraries, and archives. An excellent example would be public broadcasting systems, which often now have, close to a century of deep, deep archives that are hugely important documentation of the 20th and early 21st century. This is the broad cultural record, and I would say that as this is moving to digital form, we're seeing a sort of a slowly unfolding disaster for memory organizations, and I'd like to spend some time looking at a few dimensions of that. Okay, so the first problem is that we are, for the material that is being produced primarily for commerce, we are seeing a vast shift in the ground rules. If you think about the 20th century, you have mass markets in things like books, magazines, sound recordings. In the late part of the 20th century, you see video becoming a full-fledged content form, first through video cassettes and then later through various kinds of DVD drives and things like that. Now, the basic ground rules for all of that were these were things that were sold on the market, and memory organizations, just like any other consumer, could show up and say, I'd like to buy those things in the marketplace. They could add them to the collections. They could circulate them. There were some big arguments that have been resolved in different ways in different countries about things like, to what extent could they reformat that material from an obsolete medium to a newer format? What rights did they have for preservation? What to do about various kinds of DRM that might be attached to things. But fundamentally, the marketplace was one that memory organizations and the broader consuming public could participate in equally. Now, if you look at what's happened now, almost 2 decades into the 21st century, let's look at where we are. Music, even in the form of digital downloads, which came in at the end of the 20th century, roughly speaking, and were quite significant in the first decade of the 21st century, the sales of purchased digital music, which libraries were largely locked out of, is plummeting. Instead, the model is streaming services. And if you look at where the money's going, and particularly if you look at the demographics now, it's mostly about streaming services. Pandora, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, all of them offer these. Basically, what the deal is here is you pay a certain amount of money per month, you have an enormous catalog of music that you don't own, and it will stream you your selections according to various parameters across the internet. And you can listen to it on your phone or in your car or at home, but you don't own anything. Now, the terms of service typically of those streaming services, and by the way, everything I'm saying about music, there's a whole parallel set of services dealing with video material and what we used to call film, moving images. And all of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Netflix and its competitors. The basic arrangement here is, first of all, consumers don't own anything. So there's no way consumers can make individual choices about preserving things for the future. The terms of service fundamentally cut memory organizations out of the picture entirely. If you're a memory organization and you say, I'd like to subscribe to this so that I can pull down various streams and store them for the long term, they'll say, oh, no, we can't do that. We don't have terms of service to accommodate that. Too bad. Well, there's another property that ties back to my conversation about the keepers. If you actually look at these services, not only do whole services disappear from time to time. For example, there was a lovely service in the US that did mostly classic films, the Criterion Collection and things like that. And when AT&T bought Time Warner a couple of months ago and started consolidating, they've now announced they're shutting down that service, and all that content is going away. It will probably show up somewhere else in some more expensive setting and some new framing later, or at least some of it will, but for now it's just going away. You might think that the catalogs of these music streaming or video streaming things are stable. You might think that they're available. You might think that they tell you when they change things. On all counts. We have no idea what's in there. They will give you approximate numbers. We have 4 million, pieces of music you can stream or whatever it is. But will they tell you what goes away and why? No. Will they tell you what's added? No. Can we get a detailed inventory so we can talk about what of that is preserved in other ways? Not that I know of. So we've basically moved from markets in artifacts to these sort of closed economies, these private markets of streaming services for consumers, and we have cut out the memory organizations here. This has also happened with commercial books, although with a couple of odd kind of characteristics because of the way books are consumed and also the way the marketplaces shape up for them. So just think about this. We used to have things like books in print, which, imperfect though they might be, would allow you to make reasonable estimates of how many new books were published in what areas every year. Well, now it appears, if you look at the data, that Amazon has actually captured the book market for at least many forms of popular genre fiction, romance, science fiction, military, a few other things. They have, and nobody knows, which is a remarkable statement in itself, as much as 75–80% of the market in these areas. And most of it is things that are essentially published through Amazon on a proprietary basis. We don't even have any idea anymore, other than some very rough estimates, of how many books are being published that we aren't preserving. This is all flying entirely under the radar. Another very good example here, although it's one with some very different characteristics, is YouTube. Now, think of this. This is this remarkable massive video. You've all seen, or I'm sure most of you have seen, these mind-boggling numbers about the number of video hours per second that are uploaded to YouTube. And if you think about that, it's not hard to understand why YouTube has a really challenging problem exercising any kind of control over what goes up there, and why they are forced to resort to such really ineffective automated means of policing that. But that's nonetheless the case. Now, it is in fact possible, it's probably of debatable legality, but it's possible in fairly straightforward ways to make copies of things off of YouTube and put them somewhere where they stay around. You might think that YouTube is a pretty safe place to put things, though. YouTube is also very volatile. In fact, I was quite fascinated to discover a week or so ago at the Internet Archive, there is a major collection called the YouTube Graveyard. And what this is these are things that YouTube has taken down for various reasons, but that various people with an archival bent have managed to capture or find and put into the Internet Archive for the record. Now, this is a very interesting kind of challenge, and it touches on what should we be doing with some of this. For example, you get a YouTube video that is a notorious piece of hate propaganda that is, written up in the press, and that turns out to be a major trigger for some kind of violence someplace. And YouTube, of course, once this is brought to their attention, says, we're going to take this down. Totally inappropriate for YouTube, and we're going to make this go away. Is there an argument, given the key nature of that video, in inciting an important event, that we ought to keep a copy of this somewhere for future scholarly analysis? Like maybe in a fairly hard to find place like the YouTube Graveyard? I think there probably is, but this now causes all kinds of recalibration about who's supposed to be doing what, about the difference between archival systems and systems of mass distribution, and YouTube certainly is positioned as a system of mass distribution, not an archive ultimately. So these are, I think, some of the areas where we face enormous challenges for our memory organizations as we try and figure out how we're going to hang on to the 21st century and bring it forward for people who want to understand it. I do want to sort of pause on that set of things, though, and look at a few other developments as we look at this new 21st century landscape and try and figure out what to do about it. There are some places where there's good news. There has been tremendous progress made in the last decade in emulation and the packaging up of emulation. And basically through that, we are beginning to see a path for taking what I'll characterize as small-scale software and being able to preserve it. By small-scale software, what I mean is software that pretty much lives on a single machine and does only limited interaction with the rest of the internet. So, for example, computationally analytic things, statistical packages, mathematical analysis packages. Not necessarily the super high-endest version of this that live on, one of the top 5 in the world supercomputers and are very highly tuned to the peculiarities of those supercomputer architectures, but the ones that are running on the desks of scholars everywhere. Another broad class of things is most of the, sort of home and office software. A third important class is the group of video games that don't necessarily have a social dimension where you play other people across the net or something of that nature, but rather you explore something locally. All of these things now seem to be increasingly within reach. There are some legal problems and other things, but these are slowly getting chipped away at, I would say. From a technical level, we're in much better shape on that than we were a decade ago. So that class of things is pretty good. But let's look at what's going on out there on the net. So I'll look at 3 sorts of things. I want to specifically look at news sites. I want to specifically look at social media, and then I want to consider a little bit the sort of broader web. Now, if you go back to the world of, let's say, around 2000, social media was in its infancy. News had certainly already started to move in a significant way to the web. And we were already starting to see hard economic stresses affecting the traditional news media as they lost revenue sources such as subscriptions, such as classified ads, and essentially were forced to live off of what digital subscriptions they could get and advertising revenue. And we've seen the effects of that on the news media. But that's relatively where we were with that. And most websites at that time were one of 2 kinds. They were either essentially forms to a database. So I want the bus schedule. I want to look up airplane fares to someplace. I want to browse in a catalog of something that I'm interested in purchasing. They were relatively static websites. I mean, they were updated all the time, but they were static in the sense that everybody who went to it tended to see pretty much the same thing. Now, what you've seen on the web is a world of ubiquitous personalization. What this means fundamentally is if you go to, let's say, a news site, it will show you news based on who it thinks you are, what it thinks your past history of interactions with the site is, and where it thinks you are physically. It may throw in some other things, but those are the 3 major factors. And but when I say who you are, I mean not just your name, but your full demographics, income rate. Do you have kids? Do you have pets? Do you have hobbies? What kind of hobbies do you have? All that stuff factors into what news you see, and of course, what advertising you see surrounding your news. So when we ask the question in 2027 about, well, what was the news reporting on the morning of June 1st, 2018 in the United States, or maybe even in New York City? What does that mean anymore? We used to be able to just capture the newspapers and we could give future scholars a pretty good answer to that. And now we can't, because it depends profoundly on the distribution of demographics. Simply knowing that an article is someplace in a database and only 3 people ever looked at it, and on the other hand, 2.5 million people got this other article in their face, really changes the understanding of the impact of news media. And we have no provisions to capture that. And the only way we could capture that, I believe, in full is with the complete cooperation of the news platforms, which doesn't seem to be in place at the moment. There are ways that we can at least begin to get some insight into this. And I've written about those last year in the context primarily of social media, but really the same issues apply to all personalized web material. But let's talk about social media specifically for a minute, because that's maybe even worse than news. Because if you look at the data, at least, it's starting to supplant news for a sizable part of the population. They get most of what one would historically understand as news through their social media feeds passed around. What are they seeing? Well, we don't really know. We know that the social media platforms allow exceedingly aggressive personalization, and that historically they have allowed these sort of stealth materials that will only be shown to certain demographics and not to people outside of them, although some of the social media now have forsworn that kind of activity. How do we begin to understand how social media is disseminating information and dividing or unifying or reshaping society? I think that is a massive challenge for memory organizations, because essentially every interaction with social media now is a personalized interaction. So there's no imaginable way we're going to be able to preserve all of this. The best we're going to be able to do is capture a sampling. It becomes much more like, I don't know, ethnography or journalism or documentary filmmaking or something like that. There's a much bigger curatorial and subjective element to it. How you do that sampling is really, really hard. And, you know, I could go into a lot of detail about that, but let's just say that the algorithms have a very strong bias to show you things that are like what you liked before and to push you out to the extremes of those likes. And that's been well documented by a number of scholars. So we need to somehow establish sampling across the social spectrum based on a whole bunch of attributes, demographic attributes. That's all I'll say about that. I simply want to flag this as a challenge that we may not like, that may be hard, and that may only have imperfect answers, but is not going to go away. And I think I want to conclude my prepared comments with a couple of broad observations based across all of those examples. When we look at that broad cultural record, we are doing poorly in 2 different areas. One area is understanding and addressing the market shifts that have impacted a group of things that we historically have understood as being comfortably part of the cultural record. Sound recordings, video materials, books, magazines, that sort of thing. These have been privatized in an astounding sense over the last decade or two, and particularly in the last decade, this notion of trading copyright for making public, and as part of that bargain, accommodating memory organizations has been just terrifically undermined. We need to think about some legislative responses to that. We need to think about whether it's going to be necessary to have national libraries play a bigger role than they have in the past in dealing with this. But I also think even more important and largely unaddressed is we need to have a cultural conversation about this. Remember the story I told about scholarly publishing and how that was infused by a set of kind of common values and understandings, including that the integrity and preservation of the scholarly record was important, was essential. We don't necessarily have that for these sectors of the broad cultural record. We really should be reaching out from our memory organizations to authors and to publishers and make that argument, to creators, to performers. We ought to make that argument that we're not here to steal your market, but it is essential as a kind of a common cultural value that this material live on, and you need to work together with us to do it. That cultural shift, I think, is much, much more important and much more profound than simply passing a couple of very technical amendments to copyright law, for example. On the other side, as we look at this pervasive phenomenon of personalization, this move from thing to personalized performance in a way that can, neither be captured nor recreated at genuine scale. I think we're really challenged to recalibrate and rethink what we mean by stewardship of the present and how to bring a sense of it forward into the future. We're not going to be able to collect this material in the ways that we've historically understood it. We're going to need to really have an almost philosophical rethink, being mindful of the limits of technology, the limits of economics, the limits of resources, of how we address this material. And I think this is a conversation that it's going to be tremendously important for us to have over the next few years. So these are perhaps the biggest issues I see when I look at what we're up against in dealing with the digital cultural record. There are certainly many more things I haven't had time to talk about. One that is very much on my mind is the boundaries between personal digital archiving and public digital archiving, how things make transitions from personal and family to broader public archives and special collections. That is a sort of an amazing magical process that has happened through archives and special collections in the physical world. And it's one that, when you really dig into it, varies case by case and is fraught with issues of trust, personal connection, deposit agreements, sensitivity to various kinds of concerns. How we move that to the digital world is a very interesting set of challenges. And again, it gets deeply at various kinds of cultural norms. It's not really a narrowly legal thing. Closely related to that, look at the incredible role over the past few centuries that private collectors have played in preserving the cultural record, not the scientific or scholarly record, but the cultural record. Absolutely key role, especially in the early decades or even early centuries in some cases, when material went into the public markets. How do collectors and collecting work in the digital world? This is something I've seen very little explored, although there are a couple of talks later with tantalizing topics, and perhaps we'll get into some of that. But there are many other questions like this, perhaps the biggest theme that I'll just underscore in closing is many of these are cultural. They're about how our societies think about the importance and the nature of the cultural record, about what should be preserved, where those decisions should be made, who should do the preserving, and under what terms should it be accessible when. These are things that I think we need to recognize as questions of culture rather than questions of law. Law tends to, at its best, come along late and try and crystallize consensus in culture. At its worst, it preempts culture in various ways, or tries to, and creates other problems. But I think we really must seek venues for the cultural conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cliff. What a great way to start the morning, and grappling with what is arguably the greatest challenge for our profession this current age. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and conversation, if that's okay with you.
Yes,
yeah.
That was my deliberate intent.
Good. So I'll just ask everyone to speak into the microphones and introduce yourselves before you ask your question. So, anyone want to go first?
Hello, my name is Wayne Jones. I'm at Carleton University. You mentioned at the end there about personal saving and also the role that collectors have played over the past couple of centuries. I wonder if you could say for the digital age, what role, obviously I presume it wouldn't be the panacea, but what role is played preservation-wise by people and organizations that are illegally copying things and saving stuff?
I think the answer, this is a great question, and I'd love to have more data on it. I mean, I have a little anecdote on it, but we don't have near enough data. So from a strictly legal frame, just to set up a contrast, it appears that although there is some bits of legislation that start getting at a notion that maybe digital collections are inheritable, but if you spent a lifetime building a library of physical books, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to pass on to the next generation, to somebody, and totally unexceptional. If you've been buying your books from Amazon and you've amassed 2,000 books on your Kindle, it is anything but clear that somebody can inherit those legally. It is certainly likely that if nobody tells Amazon that you're dead and they know your password and like that they can probably keep on using the material. That sits on the ambiguous kind of boundary layer. Another phenomenon that I think is very important is this notion of aggressive rescue and swarming. And you see this in a number of organizations that are affiliated with the Internet Archive, like Archive Team, where you see announcements that historically important sites, now largely abandoned, are about to be shut down. And groups of digital archivists leap to the occasion and basically go and try and pull as much material off this using the very high bandwidth connections and high performance computing capabilities of platforms like the Internet Archive in a very short time frame. So a very good example of this is a site called GeoCities, which a few of you might remember. Back in the early days of the web, this was one of the first places where people put up what I would characterize as public websites. I mean, they're very static and archaic and things like that. But on the other hand, there are some important websites there of people who died or just abandoned them that probably are worth capturing for historic reasons. And a year or two ago, I forget the exact date, GeoCities just announced, we're closing down in 10 days, and if you want your stuff, you better get it off of here. And of course, many of the endangered sites were created by people who were dead or not paying attention anymore or didn't get the word or whatever. So the archive team basically got on this and moved all of that material. Another interesting example that's a little different, by the way, is what happened after the 2016 election in the United States, where there was grave concern that a lot of material dealing with environmental and climate change issues would disappear from federal government websites rather suddenly, and that in fact, at some level now, the federal government was the U.S. federal government was an increasingly unreliable partner in preserving not just the cultural, but indeed the scholarly digital record. And so there was a huge movement of concerned scientists, digital archivists, and others to get that material moved off of those sites rather quickly. Now, since that material was government material, it was not protected under copyright, and there was no issue there. I would say the GeoCities thing probably again gets into a gray area about the legality of that, because those sites were in fact copyrighted. You can also see a number of good examples of people breaking various kinds of DRM protection and keeping personal copies of things. I would say that stuff is largely untested at this point. Mostly nobody's been really eager to push for too many test cases for that in the courts. There have been a couple of interesting ones. For example, in the States, under the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, you have seen auto and tractor companies trying to protect their software. So you can't fix your tractor because you're violating the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Your tractor software has DRM on it. That one, I believe, actually went to court and lost. And it should have lost. I mean, it's a preposterous proposition. So I think there's a lot we don't know yet. And when you throw in the international dimension here, because the answers to this are probably going to vary significantly from country to country, due to peculiarities of the various national copyright laws, I think it's going to be a long time before we sort this out. But history says those personal collections are important, and the ability of third parties to aggressively rescue is important. Yes.
So I was thinking that the digital world, and especially some of the material that you've been talking about, is very global. And the notion of where it comes from, and sort of that notion of a national imprint, or that used to, in many ways, the world used to divide into countries with legal deposit would do for their own country, and the world was covered. Those notions are quite antiquated now. But is the notion of, is there still, I'm interested in your thoughts on whether national still matters. So what is it, to some degree, in terms of, do you privilege things that are in a country when you're thinking of preservation on a national scale? Do you privilege things that have some dimension of, in our case, Canadianness, or just any thoughts on that as we move forward?
That's a wonderful question, and there are so many dimensions of that. I could have done an hour just on that. I mean, it is one of the great puzzles and conundrums of the current age. Let me just make a few observations. I think that national libraries, of course, have a perfectly comprehensible and natural emphasis on things that are uniquely of their nation. And sometimes they'll interpret that broadly, so that, for example, if that country has a history of some colonialism or something, they will also pay attention to former colonies where they still speak the national language or things of that nature. So you'll see some sort of kind of extended, national boundary there, which is, again, easy to understand. I think that the broader set of memory institutions, to some extent, naturally follow what's important to their constituencies. And so when you combine those two, you do see a biasing towards good coverage of the relatively wealthy and technologically advanced countries. On the other hand, you also see those nations often having a lot of scholars now who are very interested in the developing world and what's going on there, and want to capture material for scholarship in that area. So you see all kinds of regional studies and things of that nature that are doing a tremendous amount of digital capture in other regions around the globe. Often, those are regions that, how to put this? So in the digital world, at least, they are very much living in the now. They are using the digital media as a way of communicating and having political discourse and cultural discourse that's very much in the present time. And they may not have a lot of archival resources in that country to preserve that. So the focus is very much on active discourse. And so as we capture that in the better resourced countries of the West, we de facto may be developing an archive of their present that we can return to them at some point. One of the fascinating developments that I've been watching is the attempts to deal with endangered archives and libraries around the world in conflict areas, for example. And actually, I'd go farther than just archives and libraries. It's also architectural sites and some other things. You see the same museum collections. You see the same kind of movements there about, well, if we can capture this digitally really well, we can put a backup copy somewhere else away from the conflict zone. And when they're ready, we can give them a copy back and somehow begin to restore a national or regional patrimony. And that's a kind of a wonderful development, although it's one that's very fraught at the same time. So there are a lot of interesting things going on in that area. I guess the one other thing I just mentioned that, again, the global network has really enabled is the growth of diaspora communities of various kinds of immigrant from a given place who still know the language of the homeland as well as perhaps of their adopted land, and stay in touch, and how political and social movements flow now across borders in a much faster and more fluid way than they could in the pre-internet days. And how we document those is a very interesting question. Maybe one more question that I could field fairly concisely.
Okay, this is a yes/no question. Sort of. And it has an expiration date, so I'll ask this as the last question, which is, so I'm a Flickr user, and just yesterday I got the long anticipated email from Flickr saying, as of a certain specific date, it's like the GeoCities thing, as of a date next year, free accounts will be capped at 1,000. And so Flickr has tens of billions of images. And what's really interesting here is that a huge number of them are tagged with Creative Commons licenses. And a large set of those have quite a bit of metadata on them, whether tagging or geotagging or some sense of that. So the question is, given the license on them, should we be grabbing images of relevance to our organizations before that deadline in 2019? Because these images will disappear from the web.
I would say yes, absolutely. And I would also say I had not heard about that particular one, and I'm wondering how it interacts with things like the old Flickr Commons work. That would be an interesting question to get some clarification on, because many memory organizations invested significantly in putting content up on Flickr Commons over the last decade or so. The only other thing I'd say is, rather than a lot of kind of haphazard organizational activity, it would probably be much more effective if we could figure out some way to do that as a big sweep, working with a partner like the Internet Archive or the Wikimedia Foundation or Flickr itself, if it has some interest in that. That might be a really good way to go for it. And I would hope that, one of these things, to tie it back to the theme of this conference, that you start to factor into your planning is these things are going to happen in the future. And the more we set up mechanisms to mobilize collective action rescues here, and not have to have individual panics, service by service, the better off we'll be. Thank you so much.
So we have a coffee break now. Please be back at 10:45. We're going to start promptly then. Thank you. So thank you for all being so attentive to my spoon. At some point I'm going to eat my yogurt, but for now I'm going to use this. So what a great start to the morning. I already feel a little bit smarter myself, but I set a low bar, so it's all up from here. Our next session is an overview of the results of the capacity survey undertaken by the Digital Preservation Working Group, which is a project expertly led by Grant Hurley, Digital Preservation Librarian at Scholars Portal. For the first part of this session, there'll be a presentation by Grant on some of the key findings of that survey. And that will be followed with an opportunity for you to discuss briefly at your tables. You'll find on your tables sets of questions. So we're asking you to respond to one or two or all three of the first set of questions. Please, when you do so, and I'll remind you after Grant's presentation, but we need somebody to actually write down the thoughts at the table. There will be a chance to report out later in the day, but the Preservation Working Group also wants to capture your thoughts and ideas as we move forward. Without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Grant.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. And thank you so much to Cliff for his excellent keynote talk. That's a very hard act to follow. But I'm glad to sort of bring some of the things that he talked about really down to ground a little bit more in talking about the results of this survey. So the presentation represents the first set of public results of the Carl Digital Preservation Working Group Survey of Capacity and Needs at Canadian Memory Institutions. And the goal of the survey was, I'm going to switch slides here. Nope, apparently not. Would you mind troubleshooting this little, do I have to point it like a TV remote in a particular direction? Well, I'll tell you about the goal of the survey while we're troubleshooting the remote. We wanted to establish a clear picture of the state of digital preservation activities in Canada and identify gaps and needs across Canadian memory institutions. So, the basic idea really is just to have good information in hand about what's going on across the country when it comes to digital preservation, from which we can start having a broader discussion, like today, about strategies, policies, and resource allocation, not to mention potential areas for coordination and cooperation within and across different sectors. So the survey was conducted in 2 phases. And phase 1 concerned just members of CARL and had 26 respondents. And phase 2 targeted memory institutions of all types. So phase 2 respondents included 7 academic libraries who were not members of CARL, 5 community or nonprofit organizations, and 13 government-based organizations as well. And these included large and small archives, public libraries and museums at many levels of government. So we had a pretty good array of respondents, of 51 in total. I really want to thank the hard work of the survey subgroup that was part of the Digital Preservation Working Group, including Corey Davis, Susan Haig, Steve Marks, and Michael Moosberger for all their feedback. The amazing support of Lise Brin in administering the survey, and also the writing and editorial assistance of Kathleen Shear. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to give the combined results of the 2 phases. Having more data kind of together from these 2 phases gives you a much more accurate picture of the results overall. And I should say that there really wasn't a great deal of divergence between CARL and non-CARL respondents in general. When there were kind of interesting differences between the 2 groups, I'll note them essentially. Is there a chance I could get back to using my slides? It's now time. Okay, well, you're going to continue to listen to my voice and take the words in your mind, like it's like it's the 19th century. Which is ironic considering we're talking about digital preservation. I often find it's very important to define what digital preservation is in these contexts. In various teaching roles I've had, it's not always understood across the room about what it is we're talking about. So I use a definition from the Digital Preservation Coalition. And they define digital preservation as the series of managed activities necessary to ensure continued access to digital materials for as long as necessary. So it's essentially keeping digital materials alive into the future. Whether those are digitized, scanned from some analog source or some other source, or born digital. Okay.
Sorry, Francis.
We back in business? It's okay. Of course, I can't really see where we are. Oh, perfect. That's great. How? Oh. Okay. Should I have two remotes, one for English and one for French? That would be very Canadian. Okay. Perfect. Okay, I need to go back some. All right. I should be on outline.
Yeah.
There we go. Wonderful. Thank you for your help. It's a crowdsourced presentation. So the way the survey was structured was around a bunch of different activities that kind of combined together to make a picture of digital preservation capacity. So we looked at collections, which was essentially establishing what kind of content respondents are caring for. Organization and governance, how respondents are showing organizational commitment to digital preservation work. The status of policies, procedures, and the adoption of standards among respondents. Tools used for preservation processing. Approaches to access and discovery. The storage of digital assets. And questions around resourcing, what staff and funding are available. And at the very end, I'll try and give kind of a bigger picture look of these areas in comparison with one another as a way of trying to identify strengths and weaknesses across the survey so we can kind of come up with a conclusion. And the idea behind this was really that by looking at these different areas, we get a very good picture overall of what kind of digital preservation activities and capacity is occurring in these respondents' organizations. As we know, digital preservation is a very complex set of interdependent activities. It's not just implementing technological tools. It's not just having a policy. You really have to be doing many different things at once to keep a digital preservation program afloat. I do have a short time. There's a lot of data, so I'll be skipping over things and jumping pretty quickly through these categories. A report with full survey results is going to be prepared for publication. And I'd be interested to know in some of the discussions if there are other things I didn't touch on as far as data goes that you'd like to hear about in the final report as well. So let's begin with collections. That's the slide that's up there now. The survey asked if your organization is collecting or accepting born digital materials, from where are they sourced? The majority of respondents selected the organization itself. This would be operational or administrative records, as well as publications, for example. And private records from donors. And the high proportion of academic respondents is represented in the third item there around faculty members and researchers. That was back. There we go. We'll figure this out eventually. The second question moves from where content is coming from to what kinds of content is being collected. And the question was, if your organization is collecting born digital content, what are the content types? And most respondents selected more archival type materials, media-based materials first, like photos, audio, moving images. And these were followed by private papers and administrative and operational records, which could take a number of different forms. And research data and theses were followed by more library-like content, publications and data, things that are sometimes bought by libraries, and web archives fell at over 50%, just over 50%. So common areas of convergence really were organizational records and private archives and media. The academic sector places higher emphasis on a wider variety of materials, I would say. So theses, web archives, purchased and licensed publications, research data, whereas government and nonprofit organizations tended to focus more on materials coming from organizations and donors. All respondents are involved in digitization activities, but not all are collecting born digital materials. We had 3 respondents, which is about 5%, that indicated that they're not collecting any born digital materials at all at this point, largely because they feel they don't have the capacity to preserve them. All of these were government units, which was interesting, and of different kinds, so different levels of government. So now we're on to organization and governance. And first up was the question, what is the current state of your organization's commitment to digital preservation as expressed through language or wording in a strategic plan or mission statement? And the idea behind this question is that support from digital preservation for a digital preservation program comes from some commitment at a higher level. 24% had no language in place, 42 indicated that some language change was being planned, in draft or waiting approval, and 35% have language already published, so it's already available. Other organizational commitment indicators include how work across the organization is organized or directed. So 75% of respondents have digital preservation activities occurring in more than one unit across the organization. The ones most commonly listed are archives and special collections units and systems and IT. And CARL members tended to have more units involved. So 88% of CARL respondents had more than one unit responsible for digital preservation, as opposed to 52% of non-CARL respondents. 76% of respondents have an individual or group responsible for coordinating digital preservation activities across the organization. And the majority of these individuals were senior leadership type teams or administrators. And non-CARL respondents were more likely just to have an individual librarian or archivist in a non-management role responsible for coordinating this work. And finally, 47% of respondents have a committee or working group for digital preservation, so just under half. Another interesting measure was the level of engagement with other groups, projects, or initiatives related to digital preservation. And this showed some divergence as well between respondents. So 85% of CARL members responded yes to the question of whether they're engaged in some project or initiative outside of themselves, versus 56% of non-CARL respondents. And so the average overall was 71%. Engagement was lower with community and nonprofit groups, and government-based respondents met about the average for the phase. And the 2 word clouds at the bottom illustrate some of those initiatives that were listed. Phase 1 respondents, of course, being CARL members, pointed to more academically focused groups, including CARL itself, as well as regional consortia and things like locks and clocks. While phase 2 respondents mentioned the Digitization and Digital Preservation Discussion Group and the Association of Canadian Archivists, among other professional associations. So that tended to be where they were engaging more around this area. For this section and the others that follow, respondents were prompted to select and enter specific gaps and challenges faced related to that area. So for this section, for organization and governance, the top selections were a lack of resources to pursue organizational change. So 65% of respondents selected this. Lack of resources to participate in collaborative efforts. Lack of communication and coordination among stakeholders. And a lack of high-level organizational commitment or support. So in summary, for organization and governance, I think it could be said that there's a broad commitment to digital preservation among respondents, either at present or in progress. Most respondents have an individual or group that's trying to coordinate or authorize this activity. Though there does seem to be this trend of different units across an organization independently pursuing this kind of work. And so that could lead to issues around resourcing, for example, or competing budgets. They don't tend to be super well coordinated at the higher level. CARL respondents are engaged in the sort of larger arena of the many initiatives and projects and conferences and things that are going on in this field. And respondents from other sectors are less likely to be engaged. And we can talk about why that might be later. So this might be an area of focus going forward. So now we're moving on swiftly to policies, procedures, and standards. So when asked, what is the status of your organization's digital preservation policy? 33% of respondents indicated that they had not yet started. 49% said that they were in various in-progress stages, and 18% had their policies approved. CARL respondents tended to have less progress in this area, so 42% of CARL respondents had not yet started a policy, versus 24% of non-CARL respondents, so a bit more strength in the policy area outside of CARL. We see similar trends in relation to documented procedures and workflows for digital preservation. So these tend to be a bit more hands-on. So when asked what is the status of digital preservation procedures or workflows, 18% had not yet started, 59% were in progress, and 24% had documented them in some form. Here, non-crawl respondents also showed some strength, where 28% responded documented and reviewed regularly as far as their procedures go, versus 8% of crawl respondents. So again, a bit more emphasis on policy and procedure development outside of crawl. And there are a number of other questions in the survey relating to different aspects of kind of a policy stack for digital preservation. So 63% have digital preservation related plans or strategies in place. For example, guidelines for format migrations, metadata standards, or digitization quality standards. 55% have adopted common standards, best practices, or guidelines in digital preservation. So this would include things like OAS or METS premise for metadata, for example. 28% have used a self-audit or gap analysis tool to assess their programs, and 18% are interested in achieving a trustworthy digital repository certification. And this is interesting, 23% of CRAL members versus 12% of non-CRAL indicated this interest, so a bit more interest among CRAL members. And the ones who were interested in among non-CRAL members were government-based archives, so there's a slight interest in that area outside of CRAL. So the top gaps and challenges listed were broken down into policies and procedures. So on the policy side, the top issue was lack of time and resources for policy development, which 88% respondents selected. After that, policies are ad hoc or project specific, and lack of knowledge for policy development. On the procedure side, lack of time and resources for procedures documentation, similar to policy, 75% selected this. Procedures are ad hoc or project specific again, and lack of knowledge was the third one as well. So it's essentially quite the same. So from these results, it seems that formalized and documented policies are largely unstarted or in progress among respondents. The slightly stronger status of documented procedures and strategies in contrast to policies points to work motivated by practical concerns, but also a possible gap where you don't have a policy framework really to tie some of these procedures together. The adoption of standards is mixed, and there's little appetite for formal certification at this time. So that's something that's not really on people's tables. The main issue really comes down to a lack of time and resources to sit down and draw out policies and procedures. And non-CRAL respondents, as I noted, tended to be a bit strong in this area. And I would have thought this was because of the proportion of government respondents, because there tends to be more of an emphasis on policy within government. But this is not actually the case. It was pretty well distributed among the non-CRAL respondents. So kind of an interesting mystery there. All right, so we're on to tools for preservation. These are the different things that organizations are doing to physically process materials. So digital forensics tools, which are used for acquiring materials from media, such as floppy disks and hard drives, and they're most often used in archival environments. They're being used 27% of the time by respondents. And of the non-CRAL group of respondents, the majority of these were from government-based archives. This is an area of activity that's worth noting. Digital preservation processing tools tended to have slightly more use at 41%. And these are commonly used to prepare digital materials for long-term storage by computer fixity checks, performing file format identification, characterization, and validation and normalization, and compiling preservation metadata. So the most common tool in use was Archimatica. 86% of respondents who are using these tools were using Archimatica as one of them at least. Those 65% of that group was just using it in a testing capacity. So quite early days in terms of actual adoption of this tool. Other tools in use mentioned once or twice were Preservica, locally developed workflows of various kinds, and Amendora's preservation capabilities. So the gaps and challenges in this area were in relation to digital forensics, lack of staff and knowledge and skills at 57%, lack of access to software, and lack of access to hardware. And on the preservation side, lack of money to support tools, lack of staff knowledge and skills, and lack of software and tool support. So in summary, fairly low adoption of preservation tools, I think, among the respondent group. And this was represented pretty evenly across respondents. There's slightly stronger use of preservation processing tools over tools for forensics, as we know. And this really just boils down to reality that most respondents are not performing a set of functions considered important for long-term preservation. And many of these, the uses of these tools are just really getting started. That's not to say you have to use these tools specifically all the time to do digital preservation. I didn't want to be so prescriptive. But for certain kinds of content, it is considered a best practice or a good thing to do. Just want to make sure I'm on the right slide. Is that access and discovery? Good. It's like, if I'm one behind, we're in trouble. Okay, great. So responses are a bit stronger when it comes to access and discovery. 100% of CARL respondents are giving access to digital materials via web-based platforms. 68% of non-CARL respondents also do so. Other common approaches mentioned were use of shared folders like Dropbox and computer terminals. Most respondents are using things like Atom, Dataverse, DSpace, and Alendora on the CARL side. Non-CARL members tend to be using various proprietary formats, or products, as well as Atom as well. I'm going to pause briefly on the gaps and challenges, but we're going to move on because we have more things to talk about. In summary, access seems to be a much more mature area for respondents, though there's a variety of tools in play, and so issues around consolidation and integration might need to be resolved. Respondents also noted in the comments that privacy and intellectual property issues, as well as scalability for existing tools, remains a barrier. We're moving now on to storage. Questions of where and how much. An initial question asked about what storage systems or media are currently used to hold digital assets. And respondents could select multiple options. Local network storage came out on top for almost everybody, followed by removable storage like hard drives, CDs and DVDs, and tape. And other methods that are considered good for digital preservation, like cloud and replicated storage services like locks, kind of came out near the bottom. CARL members were higher users of cloud storage at 65% versus 28% of non-CARL members. I also had respondents estimate storage quantities. And you can read those numbers up on the slide. I'm not going to read them all out. 37% of respondents, though, could not indicate what kind of storage numbers they had in either area, so they just had no idea how much was stored. And one respondent quite rightly pointed out, you need like a very good management tool in some ways to be able to parse out how much digitized versus born digital content you're storing. So that points to another issue where there's kind of a lack of high-level management of these kinds of things within institutions. We also had survey respondents estimate the proportions of content on different storage systems. So 61% were able to give an answer in this area. And it came out that 61% of assets were on network systems of some kind, 2% on internal media, like a hard drive within a computer, and 37% on external media of various kinds. So this would be hard drives and floppy disks and flash drives and the rest. Community and nonprofit respondents largely rely on external media to store assets. Most of them did not select any kind of network storage at all, so they're still using hard drives as their preservation source storage, which is a potential area of risk. I think we can agree. Those are the gaps and challenges when it comes to local storage. High cost was the first one selected there. But in general, there's, I think, a bit more comfort and confidence in storage in comparison to other areas. But the transition to cloud and other preservation-friendly storage approaches has been pretty slow, especially outside of academic libraries. And as we can see, there's still a large proportion of material being kept on external media of various kinds. So they may need to build up more capacity in terms of forensics capabilities to get that data off of those media. So this could be quite a risk, I think, as far as preservation goes. Another complex area was staffing, and this was one that I could sort of spend all day talking about because there's lots of information here. I'm going to kind of gloss over it though, and we can get into the details a bit more if interested. So the survey asked respondents to list the roles of their organizations with responsibilities related to digital preservation, and they were asked to give job titles and associated FTE values at a percentage, so like 20 or 40% or whatnot. The average number of roles came down to 3. Though on the chart on the left, you can see that few organizations have no roles and 15% have more than 5. So there's kind of some distribution there. And the average FTE per role was 37% of a person's time. And the chart on the right kind of shows how FTE sort of changes based on the number of roles you have. So if you have more roles, you tend to have a bit more FTE. And sometimes if you have one role, you have a little bit more FTE as well. But there's a number of different ways that we can kind of parse out this information. I was interested in how much FTEs kind of added up. So among CARL members, 84% do not have at least one full-time role dedicated to digital preservation. And 68% do not have staff roles with digital preservation responsibilities that add up to 100%. So almost no one has a single person, and very few have even the equivalent of a single person working in this area. And it was pretty much the same with non-CARL members. They were a little bit stronger. There was just a bit more staffing time among those respondents, but not by much. So overall, CARL members averaged out at 1.04 FTE. That's like about one person. Non-CARL members were at 1.19, and the total average was 1.11. And the median value there was 0.75 FTE on average. So taking out some of the higher outliers or lower outliers, it was 75%. Interestingly, there are intentions to expand staffing. 49% indicated they expected to expand staff responsibilities, and 88% said that they would do so via reassignment. So having existing staff retrained in some way to do this kind of work. And 44% also indicated they would hire new staff. When it comes to gaps and challenges in this area, lack of funding for new positions was the top one, unsurprisingly, followed by lack of staff knowledge and skills and lack of resources for training and professional development. So in my view, it seems that there's low staffing for digital preservation overall, and most staff are focusing on this as a small portion of the responsibilities. So of the 145 job titles that were put in there, 54% had 20% FTE or less assigned to those roles. 17% were 100% FTE positions, and the other 29% fell sort of in between. I also kind of looked at this, it's not in the slide, but out of curiosity, and for 81% of CARL members, staffing for digital preservation in total was less than 1% of staffing of the library overall. So most CARL members have less than 1% staffing for digital preservation over their total FTE values for that library. Does that make sense? Yeah, so luckily CARL publishes FTE statistics for the libraries. So I was actually able to do this just for CARL members, but not for non-CARL, because I asked, but they didn't give me very consistent information. And so looking at digital preservation staffing against total staffing came out at 1% or less FTE for most respondents, 80% of them. Does that make sense? Yeah, good. So I'll be interested to hear if this makes sense. If you feel that this is enough or not. Not all institutions may need a full-time person. It's not necessarily a bad thing. These things are distributed among roles either, depending on the needs of the institution. So the question is really like how much staffing is needed and what would be ideal in terms of getting the work done based on the size and resources of the institution in question. I did take a look at an NDSA survey that recently came out on digital preservation staffing. And most of the respondents from the States in this, their average FTE among respondents was 13 FTE to 1 here in Canada. So that tells you something. Very quickly go over some of the funding questions. The majority of respondents are funding digital preservation through general budget lines, but 78% could not indicate what percentage of the organization's budget was dedicated to digital preservation. Of the 11 who responded, 45% said less than 1%. The good news is that 65% expect funding increases for the next 1 to 2 years, though few could indicate what that anticipated increase would be. And the associated gaps and challenges in this area were allocation of resources were too low in comparison to needs, funding is not sustained, and lack of a business plan. I mean, it's interesting as well that a lot of non-CARL respondents indicated that their sole source of funding was from grants and awards, which is kind of a problem when it comes to long-term preservation. If you're doing it on a one-time basis with one-time money, it's very difficult to do. So this is an area of concern, I would say. There's also kind of in the comments, a lot of people observed a kind of catch-22 sort of scenario where they needed to do the work in order to advocate for the funding, but they can't do the work without getting the funding. So there's kind of like an issue there where, yeah, it's a catch-22. We need to define that. So I'm gonna just quickly go over kind of the summary part I mentioned before. So I developed a very crude kind of scoring rubric based on the quantitative responses from the survey, and divided them across the 5 sections to end up in a score of 15 points. So this is not a formal assessment. It's just a method of comparing strengths and weaknesses at a higher level to sort of understand how things are distributed. And the idea of capacity in this context is only in relation to the survey itself, not some external standard. I'm not applying like some other broader preservation assessment standard out there. That tends to be a bit more complicated. So the threshold is pretty low. Oh yeah, that was the slide that it should have been. So overall organization and governance was the strongest, followed by storage and policies and procedures, and tools and staffing, as you kind of figured out probably from the presentation, were the lowest. And the chart on the right shows the average percent capacity for each section among respondents. So the total average score was 8.78 out of 15, or about 59% capacity. And you can see here kind of the distribution of scores across respondents out of 15. And it ended up being kind of close to a standard distribution curve. 29% of respondents landed in the middle with scores between 7 and 9, and therefore about 46 to 60% capacity, kind of in the estimation of the survey. And relative capacity here is just simply the total score expressed as a percentage. Interestingly, I asked respondents to rank their level of activity overall using like an IT maturity scale out of 5, and they were pretty accurate in terms of assessing where they're at as well. They kind of had a good sense. So 33% put themselves in the first or initial level, which means that processes are ad hoc or uncontrolled, while 37% put them at the second level, which was repeatable. And so it's starting to show some consistency. So most people kind of lined up with generally where they fell out in the scoring. I also wanted to note near the end that there wasn't a one-to-one relationship between larger institutions and a higher capacity. Some institutions with relatively small budgets, for example, in the context of Carl, are doing very well in this area, and others that you would expect to have a lot of investment in this area based on their budgets overall or staffing weren't. So it really comes down to, I think, more what institutions have been mustering at that level, at the local level. So that was a quick fly through the numbers. Keep an eye out for that final report. In the meantime, I'm really looking forward to hearing discussion at the tables first, and then as part of a panel afterward. Thank you so much.
You can stay there, Grant, if you want. I think, thanks, Grant. That's given us a lot of great information, a snapshot of where we are here in Canada. Lots of places to go. I think, given the time, I'm going to make an executive decision to just bring the panelists up. We have a small panel, so if you want to come up here to respond to the survey, since we have more time this afternoon set aside for the table discussions. So we'll bring the panel up, have them respond to the survey, and then hopefully we'll still have a bit of time to have a group discussion about some of these initial reactions to the results. So as they're sitting down, I'll just introduce them. We have Lisa Goddard here, directly to my left, Associate University Librarian for Digital Scholarship and Strategy at the University of Victoria. Oh, you've arranged yourselves as per my notes. It's very good. Yeah. You anticipate, Jeff, because I didn't tell you anything. Jeff Harder, Associate University Librarian at the University of Alberta, and Mirelle Laforce, Director of Legal Deposit and of the Preservation of Heritage Collections at BA&Q. So maybe one of you wants to start out and give us your initial impressions of the survey results. Lisa?
Sure. Okay, so, I felt that there was a lot of good news at the regional and the national level. Actually, we have widely available preservation tools, Archivematica primarily, but others as well. We have regional storage networks with integrated preservation services like the Ontario Libraries Research Cloud, Copal West Vault. We have certified trusted repositories, including Canadiana and Scholars Portal. And we have national organizations, including Carl Portage and CRKN, who are already really working in this space and thinking a lot about this area. So when I looked at the survey, I thought, we're pretty strong together, actually. There are definitely places that we need to work further at the national level, so we have to continue to knit together these regional solutions and coordinate that infrastructure work. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is to figure out governance, like what kind of governance model is going to work in this hybrid sort of regional, national level, because I don't think we totally have answered that question, and that is an impediment to going forward and working together. At the national level, I think there's an opportunity, obviously, to keep lobbying for infrastructure at places like ISED, but at other funding organizations where an ask at a national level is likely to be more palatable than little organizational asks. I think that at the national level, we can identify and pursue international collaborations. This is not a national thing per se, it is an international opportunity, and there are lots of other organizations doing this work that we need to be look at working with. So regionally, nationally, I think we have good momentum. There's still work to be done, but we're getting there. Our biggest challenges, really, what I see, are at the institutional level. So we're having a hard time shifting resources into digital preservation at the specific organizational level. We don't have enough people dedicated to doing this work. Many of us have said we're going to retrain people we already have, which means we have a huge training need. Because I know at my organization, and I think in a number of others, we don't have the right skill sets in the organization, or if we have them, it's like the university archivist and the head of systems who have these skills, and they can't take on this work. So we absolutely do have to create new positions in these areas, and there's a big training need. And it's not just training for the basic stuff like knowing how much stuff we have and where it is, which many of us cannot at the moment say, and using tools like Archivematica. They don't do it on their own. But there's also really higher level skill sets like digital forensics and emulation. We need quite a lot of training in these areas. So there's an opportunity, I think, for us to work together here as well. I think that Portage has been a great model for a distributed kind of training and network of expertise that we can continue to draw on for digital preservation as well. And then, you know, really these challenges at the institutional level come down to funding. It's always about money in the end, isn't it? So first of all, I would say there are opportunities to talk to the other people in your university. This isn't just a library challenge, right? The research office cares about this. The VPR cares about this. It's an institutional challenge. So there are opportunities to go and talk to those people and try to get some money from other stakeholders. And I think that if we start to develop these kind of business plans and these good arguments, it would be really helpful to share them with one another. So if you've successfully asked your VPR for money, maybe we can use some of those arguments too. So I think that's what I have to say about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Jeff?
Hey everyone, that was excellent, Lisa. I'm going to pick up on a couple of your points, but just first, thanks to Grant and all of his colleagues for conducting that survey, and I think giving us a much better baseline for what is happening with digital preservation in Canada. That's much needed work. So I was a little bit disappointed that one of the questions that we didn't ask on that survey was how are you screwing up on digital preservation? Where have you messed up? What's going wrong? You know, can you rate that on a scale of epic failure to move on, next question? Yeah, well, next time. There's always a next time. So I'm going to tell you a quick little story, if I may, because I think Lisa covered off a lot of the points that otherwise I might touch on, just about how we failed and we lost 11 theses, digital theses from our collection. You know, and I do want to go on the record to say that we have, you know, over 20,000, I think, that are in safekeeping, but, you know, we screwed up. We lost 11. The story does end well. We did get those 11 back. And they're tucked into their digital preservation bed. But we had to go back to the original creators to get those theses. There was no digital forensic exercise that we could use to retrieve those digital files. So how did that happen? Well, it was a combination of things. It was a breakdown of some of the machinery that we had. It was a breakdown of some of the people processes that we had as well. And I think that's an important thing to remember is with digital preservation, it's a combination of things that needs to come together constantly to ensure that we are doing digital preservation activity. And again, you know, some of the survey results, I think, highlight the fact that we need to continue to invest more in that process and treat it as an operational imperative that we can deliver on. So why did I confess that story to you? You know, in part because I'm not sure I realized this was being streamed and tweeted out. But, you know, there we go, and apologies, Dale. Career limiting move, perhaps, I don't know. But no, the reason I share that story with you is because we do need to share. We do need to talk about the things that aren't working, the mistakes. I think we learn the most from those situations. Also, from the U of A perspective, I think we really learned a lesson there in terms of where the breakdowns in our processes were, and because of that, our preservation systems, from a technological point of view, are much more resilient, I think, than they were before this episode happened. We also learned a really valuable lesson, which is what it means to be trusted and trustworthy. So we had to work with faculty of graduate studies and research to be able to retrieve those objects, to get them back. And, through that process, I think through that transparency, FGSR did not tear a strip off our back. They realized that this is difficult work. This is work that we need to partner on and continue to do. And so the trust element there needs to constantly be reminded for all of us. So trust as well, I think, ties into this idea of how we collaborate with each other and are in a position to be able to develop and share services as we go along. Not everyone can do everything. And so, I think the survey really highlighted for us the fact that, some organizations, big and small, are going to, we struggle together through this. So if we can find ways to come together to try to find some collaborative tools, collaborative platforms, collaborative services, solutions, share those experiences that we've had, we'll be much stronger as a community, and I think be in a better position to address some of the challenges that Cliff has put before us. So, I think I'll end there. Maybe a final comment that I'll make is, I think we really need to be cautious too that we're not operating from a culture of poverty. I think that's a very dangerous place to be. As a nation, I think if you look at our collective budgets, I think there are resources there that we can do more than we're doing today. And so we really need to do a bit of soul searching there, I think, and hopefully today's an opportunity to do that. But to try to find ways that we can leverage the investment that is currently being made and could be made to greater impact, which ideally will result in more resources and more work being done in this area. So I'll stop there.
Super, thanks, Meryl.
Oui, alors, dans mon commentaire, il y a quelques éléments que vous allez déjà avoir entendus, mais quand même. Ce qui m'a frappé aussi en regardant les résultats du sondage, c'est le lack of, manque de, qui revenait à plusieurs occasions pour expliquer certaines choses. Le manque de personnel, manque de connaissances, d'outils, d'infrastructures, de financement durable aussi. Force est de constater que la préservation numérique est une activité, c'est probablement propre à ça, en fait. C'est une activité supplémentaire à construire qui s'ajoute aux autres activités que nous avons. C'est probablement propre au numérique en tant que tel, puis on le voit bien à BNQ avec nos mandats de collecter, de rassembler, de conserver le patrimoine. On continue de le faire pour l'analogique, on doit le faire aussi pour le numérique. Mais la particularité de la préservation numérique par rapport au numérique en tant que tel, c'est peut-être le parent pauvre. Il a l'inconvénient d'être un peu moins glamour, si on veut. La difficulté de la préservation numérique, c'est que souvent on travaille beaucoup avec des objectifs à court terme sur bien des projets, tout ça. La préservation numérique doit être vue à long terme et c'est parfois difficile à gagner. Ça me fait penser parfois aux discussions sur les changements climatiques. Tout le monde est d'accord pour dire que c'est important, que c'est essentiel, mais quand vient le temps de concrétiser les efforts, ben c'est sûr que c'est gros, c'est compliqué, ça coûte cher, il faut se concerter davantage. Et puis les résultats, bien, on peut pas les voir rapidement, on va les voir à long terme dans le futur quand on va avoir été, on va constater qu'on aura conservé des traces de notre patrimoine numérique actuel. Puis en ce sens-là, la préservation est un peu en compétition avec justement les activités qui, au sein même d'une institution, mais au sein des structures de financement, dans le fond, où les priorités
vont à des projets ou à plus court terme. Ça vient souvent devancer, dans le fond, les travaux à plus long terme. En tout cas, pendant ce temps-là, quand même, je pense qu'on avance. On constate quand même. Et puis, comment dire, même si on sait comment faire les choses, c'est ça, on le fait progressivement. Ce qu'on parle peu dans le sondage, et puis M. Lynch l'a abordé un petit peu tout à l'heure, c'est qu'est-ce qu'en attendant, on ne conserve pas. Tu sais, je pense que les structures, on les a, ou si on les a pas, ben on sait qu'est-ce que ça doit être. Mais ça serait intéressant de se questionner collectivement sur le quoi, le qu'est-ce qu'on veut conserver. Là. Je sais qu'il y a beaucoup de monde dans les universités, on parle de données de recherche et tout ça, mais plus largement, là, Monsieur Lynch parlait des archives culturelles. Faudra se poser ces questions-là. On le fait dans nos institutions, bon, BNQ, BAC, certainement, mais en dehors de ça aussi, plus largement. Ce qui aurait été intéressant aussi de savoir, qui n'était pas dans le sondage, c'est depuis quand les institutions mènent des travaux de préservation numérique de façon à pouvoir voir à quel rythme elles progressent dans leurs travaux. C'est sûr que ce qui sera intéressant aussi, c'est de refaire ce sondage-là périodiquement, je sais pas, aux 5 ans ou quelque chose du genre, pour pouvoir voir la progression. Ce que j'ai trouvé intéressant au niveau de la gouvernance aussi, on disait que dans une grande proportion, les activités de préservation numérique se déroulent dans plus d'une unité administrative. C'est une réalité bien présente à BANQ. C'est sûr qu'il y a des gens des TI qui sont concernés, mais aussi on a, disons, 3 grandes chaînes de contenu numérique là, qui sont destinés à se retrouver en préservation. Donc, on a la partie des archives gouvernementales notamment, dont on est responsable. On a la partie de la numérisation, qui est une chaîne énorme aussi, qui génère du contenu numérique à être préservé à un certain endroit. Et puis, toute la portion de la préservation du patrimoine publié, où j'inclus la collecte de sites web aussi. Donc, plusieurs chaînes en parallèle qui ont toutes leurs spécificités, mais qu'on doit arriver à préserver de façon commune. Puis ça donne lieu à des échanges qui sont, à travers le temps, on apprend à se parler, à développer un langage commun aussi entre les gens de contenu puis les gens de TI, ce qui est pas évident non plus. Hein, la préservation numérique, c'est complexe. Et puis, d'arriver à parler techniquement, mais aussi de contenu plus simple. C'est un beau défi, mais ça me parlait beaucoup l'importance, ou en tout cas le fait que dans les institutions, ça soit très partagé, on le vit bien de notre côté. Ce que j'avais aussi, je trouve que ce qui sera important dans le futur, c'est de se donner d'autres occasions de partager comme ça. Je trouve que cette journée-ci, puis la mise sur pied du groupe de préservation numérique de Carl en est un bon exemple là, de créer une communauté de partage. Oui, c'est international, mais on a quand même au niveau canadien beaucoup d'expertise, puis trouver ces moments pour partager, c'est important. Juste pour comparer, on est à Bibliothèque et Archives nationales du Québec. On est membre de l'International Internet Preservation Consortium, qui fait un organisme voué à rassembler des gens qui font plus spécifiquement de la collecte de sites web. Je trouve que le regroupement partage des listes de discussion et tout ça, où on peut échanger à travers l'année, mais à chaque année, il y a un moment où on peut rencontrer les gens qui font ce même travail-là, puis c'est toujours tellement enrichissant. On est souvent bien seuls, chacun dans nos institutions, mais je pense que on est dans la bonne voie d'être ici tous ensemble aujourd'hui pour en parler. Voilà, je pense que ça fait le tour. Ah oui, au niveau de la mise en commun, tout à l'heure, tu parlais de partager aussi ce que les gens peuvent faire chacun de leur côté pour se donner des trucs pour convaincre, advocacy, pour être capable d'être plus fort chacun de notre côté pour aller chercher des sous ou de l'argent qui est quand même le nerf de la guerre. Ça va jamais aussi vite qu'on voudrait. Donc, mais ça c'est, je pense que c'est une portion importante là, des advocacy. Voilà.
Thank you. Thanks. So what's coming through clearly, I think, is the importance of that sharing and collaboration across our organizations and our sectors as well. Sustained collaboration and that need that Jeff talked about for trust. We all know the problem. I appreciate the reference to climate change. And I guess, like with climate change, one of the big questions is how can we move faster? We know the problem. It's here. It's passing us by. And what implications does moving faster have for our organizations, how we structure ourselves, how we work together? It kind of points to that need for, sometimes we say it, radical collaboration, but it does require us to rethink our organizational structures and our work. We have about maybe 5 minutes for a question or two to the panel for anyone who wants to has a burning question at this moment in time. So I'm going to hand it over to all of you. Or for any of our panelists to pick up on some of the themes. Steve.
Yeah, thanks for this panel. I was wondering really quickly if, in talking about how so many institutions have so little funding for specific digital preservation activities, I wonder if any of y'all on the panel think that it's reasonable for us to start talking instead about how to ramp up funding for digital preservation activities, and more try to shift the conversation to how digital preservation is a characteristic of all the things that we do. And whether or not there have been any, whether or not y'all have had any wins sort of shifting the narrative in that way. I think I avoided asking an actual question there.
There is a question in there somewhere, Steve. Yeah, and I don't know that since you didn't ask an actual question, I don't know if I have an actual answer, but I do think there is something to trying to, it's very difficult to parse out digital preservation as a singular activity or set of activities that happen. So I know for organizations like ourselves, I mean, we do feel like we invest, but it's very difficult to answer survey questions that say, how many FTE or where's the budget line that you can point to that says you're doing that. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's part of, the fact that we need to value digital preservation as something that we do, and it is incorporated into a lot of the digital collections and activities that we're a part of. And again, that ties into digital scholarship, that ties into the cultural record, all of those sorts of pieces. What is important, I think, in setting that up within our organizations, though, is that you don't make the assumption that it's just somehow magically happening. We need to be thoughtful and I think deliberate that there is digital preservation being built into those project plans, into those long-term sustainability activities. And I think too, in terms of the community, we need to absolutely not make an assumption that I don't need to worry about it because Steve's going to worry about it, or Andrea or someone else is going to worry about it. We need to take, community responsibility, I think, for ensuring that those activities are in place.
Yeah, I think it just needs to be something that's kind of built into the workflow every time we start digitizing something, that we're thinking about the whole life cycle of that. And that includes things like metadata, which many of us have challenges with as well. It's not necessarily well funded, but without things like metadata at the beginning of the process, then we run into these really big problems down the road when we're trying to do things retrospectively. So I think that every time when we choose a system, when we think about our networks, when we, do our metadata, all of those things need to be built in from the beginning. And as we work with researchers, we tell them this all the time, and yet we don't always follow our own advice and start with digital preservation at the beginning of our projects either. So I think that's critical.
Ben, j'irais dans le même sens, là. C'est-à-dire que oui, de s'assurer de penser dès le début où ça va aboutir. Puis de toute façon, dans le développement de nos outils, comme c'est numérique, on n'a pas le choix de penser à au processus des contenus. Donc, ben c'est ça. Il faut vraiment que ça fasse partie de nos activités intrinsèques.
Can I ask a follow-up if anybody else doesn't have anything? So in follow-up to that, then, thinking about collaborative initiatives and thinking about limited resources, which is true, is it more important then that we develop shared preservation-specific technical resources, or that we spend those resources on developing digital preservation as a core competency for librarians overall?
I don't know if there's really a right answer, but I'll take a stab at it. I think that if we kind of have a sense of how those networks are going to be established and what they technically look like, then we have a sense as well of what we need to teach people, at least at that base level. It's quite hard to start with the broad question of digital preservation and think, where would I do my training? But if I know that, we're using permafrost and we're doing it with Scholars Portal, then it's quite easy for me to imagine how I'm going to train people at least to do that one specific thing. So although I definitely think there's an enormous amount of training needed in this area, actually, it's okay to have some of the infrastructure and tools in place before we think about training. And so training is a little bit less of a terrifying kind of thing to grapple with.
So I'm going to have to move us along. I'm sorry. I've got a packed schedule today. Before I do, I'd like to thank Grant. I hope it's given you a taste of the results. As Grant said, we're going to publish the results soon, and it will be one of the points of information to move forward with. So thank you, Grant. Thank you, Lisa and Jeff and Muriel. And I'm going to ask the next panel to come join us on the stage. Thank you. Good to meet you. Do we have enough chairs? Do we have enough chairs? Okay, so it looks like we just have enough room on the stage here for all of us. Are we there? Okay, so this next session tackles the advantages, challenges, and opportunities organizations have experienced in working at scale on issues of digital preservation. The moderator for the session is Carol Urbain, who's on the steering committee of the National Heritage Digitization Strategy and Vice President of ASTED. So over to Carol.
Alors, merci, Jonathan. Alors, tel que mentionné, cette session porte sur les avantages, les défis et les occasions que diverses organisations ont rencontrés en travaillant sur des projets de préservation du numérique. Nos 6 conférenciers, conférencières, à mon avis, se complètent à merveille et ce sera d'autant plus intéressant de les entendre puisque chacun d'entre eux et elles vont nous parler d'un projet qui a d'envergure bien différente, c'est-à-dire réalisé soit au niveau institutionnel, régional ou national. Mais avant de vous présenter nos invités et de leur céder la parole, permettez-moi de vous dire quelques mots sur la stratégie canadienne de numérisation du patrimoine documentaire. At the beginning, I would like to thank you, Carl, for giving me the opportunity to talk briefly about this initiative on behalf of the members of the steering committee. I would be curious, in fact, to know how many of you have heard about this NHDS initiative. Oh, great. Wow. I'm very, very happy. In fact, the strategy was initiated in 2016 following an invitation from Library and Archives Canada to create a community of partners aiming at establishing a coordinated approach to digitization of Canadian memory institutions' collections. The initiative is about discovery, access, and preservation of heritage collections owned by archives, libraries, museums, and any other memory institutions. Alors, la stratégie numérisation du patrimoine documentaire imagine, en fait, le groupe imagine un avenir où l'accès du patrimoine documentaire canadien serait virtuel, exhaustif, omniprésent. Elle invite également la communauté des bibliothèques, archives, musées et galeries d'art au Canada, ainsi que les créateurs de contenu à mettre en commun leur expertise en vue de soutenir les initiatives de numérisation, découverte, accès et préservation du patrimoine documentaire canadien. Maybe we can change. Yes, I'm sorry. Move the slides. Anyway, as you will see, oh, thank you. Does it work? Only on one side. Yes. As illustrated, the steering committee includes organizations from across GLAMS, and working groups have been created to gather input and expertise from a broader community. Again. Okay, so if you want to be involved, because this is the most important, so you can reach our website. You can consult the website of the National Heritage Digitization Strategy. It's really easy to find out because we can just Google it. We would like also to invite you to sign it. En fait, on est à la recherche également de gens qui viennent appuyer cette stratégie-là, et nous avons même des places disponibles à l'intérieur des groupes de recherche pour ceux et celles qui aimeraient partager leur expertise d'une façon nationale. Alors, je vous invite vraiment à consulter le site web de la stratégie, et tout y est. Et bien sûr, il y a beaucoup de membres ici du comité directeur, donc des passionnés et prêts à vous donner tout renseignement que vous aimeriez avoir. Alors, further delay, I would invite John to come speak to us about Concordia's recent work. John is the archivist, the digital archivist au département de gestion des documents administratifs et des archives de l'Université Concordia. Il va nous décrire le programme relativement récent de préservation numérique implanté à travers son université. Alors, bienvenue, John. I don't know if you need it. If it works, yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. I'm John Rajan, the digital archivist at Concordia University Records Management and Archives Department. I want to start by thanking the organizing committee for allowing me to speak today. And it's very thoughtful of you to have it so close to our offices here in downtown Montreal. Our digital archives program at Concordia is relatively new, as we just mentioned, and it began during the summer of 2017. Within the past year and a half, our department has already accepted over 100 foreign digital transfers, accounting for approximately 25 terabytes of content and over 300,000 files from a variety of administrative, academic departments, as well as a number of student groups. And of course, the end goal for all of us here is to facilitate the digital preservation and access for this content, which will hold enduring value. So just to touch a little bit upon the size of our institution and who we are, Concordia is made up of 2 campuses here in Montreal. One is centrally located in the downtown core, and the other one is a little bit west of downtown in a neighborhood, NDG. We have over 37,000 undergraduate students and around 9,000 graduate students, just to touch upon the scale of our institution. More specifically, our department is made up of 12 employees. 5 of these employees are on the specifically dedicated to the records management tasks. 4 of these people are on the historical as part of the historical archives group, and I fall somewhere in the middle or often completely outside of these teams, depending on the day. I quickly wanted to mention a central piece of our digital archives program is our newly released digital preservation strategy that came out a few months ago. And this strategy has helped us situate digital preservation in the larger context of our already existing archives policies. And it also helped set some basic definitions and expectations for users. And the last thing I want to mention on this slide was building capacity within our first year. And what do I mean by this? So what we're trying to do in our department is strike a balance between building a knowledge base through training exercises, as well as acquiring new technology, equipment, and systems, and trying to move this beast along in unison is not easy, but it's something that we're really trying to do and make sure that everyone on the team is involved in. So I quickly mentioned this before, but where's our content coming from? So most of it's arriving from administrative departments, academic departments at the university, and it's coming through most of the time through our records management program. So there's already retention periods in place, so that helps a lot. And we're also collecting private donations. So we've collected a few from student groups at the university, as well as from a few faculty members. So digital preservation building blocks. So defining the scope was a big thing for us, and it's it's always kind of in flux. So one thing that I've realized now is that you want to define a scope, but it might be a changing scope. And one example for this from our department is with physical records. We accept semi-active records, but in the digital landscape, we are not. We're just accepting records that have passed a retention period and are set for permanent preservation. Collaboration at different levels, and I think this has been touched on already this morning, at all levels is key. And although technology does play a big role in digital preservation, a lot of digital preservation initiatives, at least in our circumstances, are people-driven. So people are very important in this process, obviously. And collaboration between different and often new partners is going to be essential in finding success in your program. Building a toolkit that is right for you. In a moment, I'll talk about a few of the tools we're using, but keep in mind that these tools come in many different shapes and forms, and between institutions, between departments, these could look very different, and that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. So our toolkit at Records Management and Archives, we're trying to emphasize as much as possible open source solutions when and where possible. So these three are kind of doing the heavy lifting for us right now. So Bagger, Library of Congress developed tool for packaging, verifying, and transferring content. Droid, developed out of the National Archives of the UK, for carrying out first-level file format analysis and helping us in processing. And Archivematica, which we've recently acquired, is our digital preservation system. And we'll be doing a lot of our heavy lifting in the future. And for that, we've actually gone through the Canadian Council of Archives and the Canada Digital Preservation Services program to set that up. So now some of our challenges that are evolving every day. These are just a very, very small sample of what we've run into. So as I mentioned, our records management program is great at stopping a lot of extra stuff from coming into us through the retention program. But we have questions like who's going to be doing the archival appraisal, the weeding of records, the deduplicating of records, organizing and describing. This is time-consuming work, and our tools can do a lot, but there's still a crucial human role to play here. Storage, I think this will be an issue for us for a long time, but as our collection continues to grow, how will we manage secure storage, and how will our evolving storage needs be met? And finally, questions surrounding access. I think this was touched on this morning as well. How best to facilitate this access, and being able to really meet future user expectations when interacting with digital records could be very different than how people interact with doing research right now. So making it work, these are my cliche terms, but I think that they really hold true to how we've been working so far. So being flexible, been my short experience that almost every day in this role and every transfer has brought new opportunities and challenges. So just to be open to new approaches, tools, and ways of working, because every day has the potential to be different. Openness, taking the time to explain the processes to partners and people transferring their records and donors. And this for me, it's really being open with how we do things has really helped build a new level of trust with our donors and people transferring us records. And on a final note, just a willingness to embrace change. And our digital archives program is making us really rethink almost every aspect of how we work as a team, from the interactions with the donors to the more technical aspects, digital preservation, how we're going to provide access, how you want to tackle these digital preservation challenges head on. It may be painful to start, but I think it's a necessary step in being getting off on the right foot and starting your digital preservation program. Thanks.
So thank you very much, John, for your presentation. If you have any questions for John, we will have a question period at the end of the presentation. So now I'm giving the floor to Steve Marks. Steve Marks est bibliothécaire responsable de la préservation numérique aux bibliothèques de l'Université de Toronto. Il nous parlera des initiatives en matière de préservation numérique mises de l'avant au sein de sa bibliothèque, ainsi que les démarches entreprises pour revoir cette approche. Steve?
Thank you. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about the local context at the University of Toronto Libraries and sort of some of the lessons that we've learned on our journey towards scalability of our preservation services. Because 5 minutes is not a lot of time to talk, I'm just going to say that up front, and then work back towards getting towards those lessons. But basically, two things jump out at me in the context of what's useful to this conversation. One is that we've been working toward developing tools and workflows that are relatively simple and relatively single purpose tools that are loosely coupled together into preservation workflows. I'm just thinking about that from a design perspective. The other is that we're trying to actively reject this thing that I call performative preservation, which is this idea that preservation is this action that we take and then we put a check mark in the box and we say, this thing is preserved. And in rejecting that, we're trying to instead embrace this idea that digital preservation is a characteristic of everything that we do. And everything that we do in our handling of these digital objects, from the time we get it until the time that somebody accesses it, either is good for that or is bad for it. So those are the two things that I'm going to try to work towards until I get the hook here. So scene setting, about 4 years ago, we were starting to find ourselves in a little bit of a bind. Like probably everybody here, we're starting to drown in digital stuff, right? We have things that we're digitizing. We have born digital special collections. We have electronic records. We have increasingly flow of research data coming to us, which can be huge and complicated. And at the time, the centerpiece of our preservation strategy was really focused on this sort of monolithic repository system that sort of sat, you know, at the center of all our planning and thinking about how we preserve stuff. This was really starting to bind things up as the flow of digital material kept coming in. And it's a complicated conversation, but there were sort of two big and conspicuous reasons that this was happening. One, because this monolithic repository was also a point of access to a lot of the content, there were requirements that were built into the software and that had to be supported because we had users and we had students and researchers and people who are accessing the content and people who are depositing content that are relying on it to be a certain way for access. And sometimes those requirements were at cross purposes with what we would want a piece of software to be for purposes of preservation. So there was some tension there, and things were happening that weren't always great for preservation of the digital objects that were in there. The other thing was that, again, as the volume of stuff was ramping up, some of the individual tools that repository solution used weren't really scaling well to keep up with the volume of data that we were getting. At the same time, those tools weren't always easily disentangled from this large and complicated system that we had implemented. So there was no way for us to stop using a certain tool and switch it out for something that would be much more efficient at the scale we were looking at. So what did we do in this context? We started to look at, what if we step back from this monolithic solution, and what if we instead started to implement workflows that would park some of these risks that we're developing as we're getting stuff and we're getting this giant backlog of stuff. And sometimes it's on media that's degrading, or it's on servers that are in lab spaces or other places that are very transitory. There's risk accumulating there, and we need some way to park that. So what if we do that, instead of trying to shove everything into this repository, we implement some tools and some workflows that can help park that without necessarily having to engage in this whole ingest tango that we have with the repository. And Jess, who's going to be presenting later, is going to show what one of those workflows look like. So that enabled us to get some of these flows of data that were coming to us unstuck, right? They were sort of in this holding pattern. But because we were starting to develop ways to at least get them onto safe media, say, we were able to manage some of that risk and get things flowing again in a way that let us say, okay, we can take data from you researchers now. The next thing that we did was, once we had let off some of the pressure there, we decided to take a step back and try to not reinvent the wheel in terms of solutions that we're providing. And an example of this is, we, as every institution here probably, already have a ton of managed storage, right? And we have managed storage that we understand pretty well. It's subject to good regimes in terms of backup. It has certain characteristics that are maybe more or less suited to specific types of data, but it's there and it's okay. So maybe we don't need to have this other instance of storage that's managed by the repository software. Maybe we can implement some nice policies and some nice access controls on managed storage that we already have that lets us engage in good practice, a practice that contributes to the longevity of our data without having to sock it into this repository, right? And I say that we have some options there. We have options that are local and we have options that are collaborative. And this is through the fact that we work very closely with Scholars Portal, through our great and developing relationships with Carl and with Copal and, you know, people across the country and the world, right? So there are a lot of places for us to engage and think about, like, okay, maybe this is a thing we don't need to do locally here. And once we've had that conversation, step back and said, we don't need to reinvent this wheel, we started to say, what do we actually need to do locally? And so for us, since we had developed some workflows to get data coming in and we were able to now accept workflows from our communities, and we were working out protocols for how we stash things away on our various storage platforms, we identified that the biggest gap that we had currently locally was this idea that we need some way to track these things across this platform. I mean, we sort of broke this issue that we were having trouble funneling everything into a single platform, but now it's on multiple platforms and we need to track it across many. So that's been the focus of our development for the past year and a half now, is the development of our new sort of lightweight digital asset management system, which is sort of meant to be the next wave of digital repositories at UTL, sort of stepping into the role that the monolithic repository infrastructure was holding before. I'm kind of expecting to get the hook by now. Okay, yeah, so perfect. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, we will have opportunities to talk further about the projects. Now, I would like to invite Corey and Kate to come speak to us about regional consortia. Corey est coordonnateur en conservation numérique au Council of Prairie and Pacific University Libraries, alors que Kate est co-directrice de Scholars Portal. Nos conférencières vont nous parler de ce que représente de travailler en consortium régionaux. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking about a particular piece of infrastructure around preservation storage that we built in Copal, hopefully to demonstrate what it means to work at the regional level. I'm also really interested today how the conversations evolve around not necessarily the tension, but the governance issues that Lisa mentioned between what we're doing locally, what we're doing regionally, which is really important in the Canadian context, and how that ladders up to national efforts as well. So I'm going to be talking about something called Westvault. I'm going to be talking really quickly about Westvault because I don't have that. But for some context, the Council of Prairie and Pacific University Libraries consists of 22 university libraries in Western Canada, and it really is a commitment by the directors of those libraries who are here today, many of whom are here today, to make our collaborative efforts possible. And I'd really like to acknowledge their contributions. One of the things that I think sets us apart as a regional consortia, not only within Canada, but also internationally, is that we focus very heavily on digital preservations under the auspices of the Copal Digital Stewardship Network. We focus on technology, so we provide services and tools that help people do the work that they need to do, but importantly, we also work around building communities of practice so that people actually have the skills and the capacity to use the things that we're building, which is pretty critical. And increasing awareness, stakeholder engagement is a really big part of what we do as well. So it's not only about the tools, it's not only about the people, it's about reaching out to those at our institutions that have the checkbooks and trying to get engagement there with the issues that we're dealing with. And also around training and Collaboration. This is a similar slide we could all show, but it's a complex environment, and to work as collaboratively as possible with other organizations, and also using community-led technology to do what we do. So really, it's a focus on collaboration, on community-led efforts, and open source tools, not-for-profit service providers. That's sort of the framework within which we created Westfall. There's all sorts of information on our website about the service, so I would encourage you to go there afterwards if you're interested, or approach me. It is based on something called LOCKSS, which, if for those of you who may not know, stands for Lots of Copies Keep Stuff Safe. An acronym familiar to many, but probably not all of you. This is a project that is still very much housed at Stanford University, and it's basically a peer-to-peer network that was developed to support preservation of journals as they transition to their electronic form, as we're aware of them today. And for us, the really critical parts of LOCKSS that have enabled us to use it within COPOL is that we're really interested in copies that are decorrelated and independently administered across many time zones and multiple jurisdictions. Cliff Lynch talked about this morning. The ability for those copies to be managed independently at 5 different locations was really critical for us in terms of the authenticity and the security of the scholarly record, the parts of which we are trying to manage. The LOCKSS also enables us to run this software on virtual machines at campus data centers at partner institutions, so there was no initial capital costs. When you're a consortium that spans 4 different provinces, it's really hard to get federal money and provincial money, and so we were able to do this without any upfront capital costs. And it's all community owned and community operated. So in a nutshell, we have these 5 nodes, storage nodes at 5 partner universities at their campus data centers across Western Canada, University of British Columbia, Alberta, Regina, and is that the end of, is that 5 minutes? Wow, okay. Amazing network. I must tell you, it's incredible. I'm just going to go through this because we have an advisory group that we formed to oversee our efforts, and we also work to build capacity through training and outreach. Apologies for the poor timing there. Please go to the website to learn more, and I'll hand it over to Kate. Thank you.
Sorry, hold on a second. All right, well, thank you guys all for having us here. Scholars Portal is the technical services arm of Ontario's regional consortia, OCL, and so we do lots of things, but we do a lot of digital preservation work. And initially, I thought I would just run activities, but the panel has forced me to focus on things where we're grappling with the issues around what level to engage at: local, regional, or even national. So there are 3 Scholars Portal services that come to mind here. The first is our Journals TDR. The Scholar Portal Journals platform is one of Scholars Portal's oldest services. Has been providing access and preservation for commonly held e-journals for almost 20 years now at a provincial level. In 2012, it was certified as a trustworthy digital repository, which is an indication that it's a sustainable service at a regional level. But interest from CRCan, from other consortia without sort of similar options, and increasing pressures on library budgets — it's quite an expensive service for 20 odd libraries to run — meant that we had started thinking about scaling that up to the national level. So last year, I think, CRKN established a working group to look at the feasibility of making SP journals a national service. The group included members from CRKN, Scholars Portal, University of Toronto Libraries as the service provider for OCL, as well as people from member institutions across the country. Being a fairly well-established service, and because the content being preserved is commonly held, the challenges that were identified with scaling up to the national level were more around governance, as we've heard before, and also administration of the service, so stuff like licensing and entitlements management, rather than any sort of technical issues. This group the recommendations were accepted at the last CRK and AGM, and a new group is going to be formed to take on the next little part of that work. Okay, so the second service I wanted to mention is Permafrost, which is essentially the opposite of the journal's TDR, designed to facilitate preservation of member libraries' local digital collections through a combination of training and a hosted archivematic instance and storage. Here, Scholars Portal is providing sort of a technical infrastructure, the mechanics to do digital preservation, so those who are using the service can focus on the detailed work of creating their own local and unique collections. One of the sort of primary tasks in developing the service was defining the roles and responsibilities of subscribers versus those at Scholars Portal, like what is a curation task versus what is something that needs to be done by the tools, sort of teasing that out. Because as we've heard here, many of the staff involved in the pilot were very new to digital preservation work, with little or no practical experience of what would be and sort of sense of what would be involved on their end. Not all of them, but I think a lot of them. Oh. So along with sort of training on how to use the tools, there was a significant focus on best practice advice, policy development, those types of things. What became clear was, at this point, you can't just provide a tool and walk away. That for a hosted service like Permafrost to be successful, that there needs to be sort of a large educational component to it. So this is a brand new service for Scholars Portal. It was in pilot last year and launched over the summer with its first subscribers. I think we're now up to 3 with a number of other subscribers in the works. The third thing that I just wanted to mention briefly are our storage services, which of course represent a very important piece of the preservation puzzle. Around like 4 or 5 years ago, I think, an increasing need for high quality, affordable storage for digital preservation for both our own collections and also the collections at institutions. Led us to start to really reevaluate our storage strategies. So out of that developed the Ontario Library Research Cloud, which is a secure cloud-based storage network that consists of 5 nodes at data centers across the province connected through the Orion network, which is a private research network. In its first 5 years, the LRC has proved its value providing storage starting to provide storage for our own collections and stuff like the back end of Permafrost. It's also allowed us to, I guess, pilot some sort of national storage. There's a pilot node at UVic as well. However, questions around storage, as we've heard before, really, I think, persist. How much storage we plan for seems to be something that it's hard to answer. What type of storage is the right storage? How can we partner with different people to ensure that storage is affordable, is reliable, is scalable, and preservation positive, is geographically distributed, that type of thing. So I will stop there.
So, thank you very much, Corey and Kate. Finalement, il me fait plaisir d'accueillir Pascal Montmartin et Faye Lemay. Alors, Pascal est analyste d'affaires en préservation et diffusion des collections numériques à BANQ. Alors que fait et gestionnaire de la préservation numérique à Bibliothèque et Archives Canada. Elles décriront les défis, les opportunités rencontrées lorsque l'on travaille dans des projets de préservation numérique à l'échelle nationale. Yes. Thank you.
No, that's bancu, hein?
It's big.
I'm not seeing my presentation.
It's maybe
Yeah,
we
it's
can
fair.
start with the age.
Yeah.
Yes. Oui, on y est, Pascal.
Tu vas aller en...
Excusez-moi. Donc, je vais essayer de faire un statut de où en est rendu BANQ en termes de préservation numérique. Comme l'a dit un petit peu plus tôt Mireille, on a la mission de conserver essentiellement 3 types de documents à BANQ. Donc, les documents issus de la numérisation, ceux qui sont déposés directement en ligne par les fournisseurs, et puis tout ce qui est archive, donc autant ce qui provient des ministères et organismes que ce qui provient des archives privées. Actuellement, je vais oublier de... C'est ça. Actuellement, on fait plutôt de la conservation numérique. J'insiste là-dessus parce que la préservation, on en a peut-être peu parlé depuis ce matin, mais ça inclut une migration des formats et une prise en compte donc de la pérennité de l'accès au contenu des documents. Pour l'instant, on est plutôt dans le mode conservation et on veut s'en aller vraiment vers la préservation. Donc, en termes de conservation, c'est sûr qu'actuellement, on stocke essentiellement nos documents sur des CD, des DVD. On en a presque, enfin, un petit peu plus de 170 000, donc c'est un certain nombre. On a abandonné les CD, DVD pour aller vers les supports de disques durs. Mais ce n'est pas non plus une solution. On veut vraiment aller vers un entrepôt de type OIS qui nous permettra donc d'être beaucoup plus flexible. Actuellement, on a à peu près presque 3 pétas de données. En fait, ça comprend nos trois copies. Et on estime qu'en 2027, on sera rendu à 32 pétas. Donc, on doit vraiment se prémunir, se doter d'un système de gestion approprié. Pour ce qui est, ça c'était pour ce qui était de nos copies de conservation. Pour ce qui est de nos copies de diffusion, on a un entrepôt OIS qui est basé sur DSpace pour assurer la diffusion à travers un site que vous connaissez peut-être déjà qui est numérique.bnq.qc.ca. Enfin, la responsabilité est vraiment partagée. Je pense que Mireille en avait parlé entre différentes équipes. Donc, autant la Bibliothèque nationale que les archives et que les technologies de l'information. Alors, ça fait il y a à peu près 4 ans que BANQ se préoccupe de la question de se doter d'un dépôt numérique fiable. Ça a commencé avec des groupes de travail et puis ensuite on a continué un petit peu plus loin nos travaux. Donc aujourd'hui, on a une première version de notre dépôt numérique fiable qu'on est actuellement en train de tester. C'est vraiment une version de base, c'est ce qui va se vouloir être le cœur de notre dépôt. Et en parallèle, on a aussi progressé sur tout ce qui est politique et orientation ou c'est ça. Donc cette politique de préservation du numérique va être bientôt présentée à notre conseil d'administration. Donc on espère que par la suite, elle va pouvoir être publique. Alors c'est sûr qu'on travaille, on a quand même des chaînes qui
qui existent déjà pour conserver au mieux nos documents, mais on fait vraiment face déjà à des dépôts numériques d'importance, comme celui de la commission Charbonneau, et aussi à des problèmes technologiques un petit peu plus spécifiques qui rejoignent les propos de ce matin. Pour ne pas nommer la presse plus, comme vous savez, la presse plus, la presse maintenant diffuse son journal à travers l'application qu'on a sur nos iPads, mais le contenu est directement lié, est intrinsèque à l'utilisation de cette application qui à une obsolescence programmée, et déjà des versions de l'information qui est disponible dans cette application ne sont plus utilisables. Donc on a vraiment un enjeu ici à savoir comment on va récupérer cette information. On discute avec la presse à ce sujet, mais le problème est assez important parce qu'il y a une grosse différence entre l'information qui est disponible à travers l'application et toute son interactivité et une information qui serait beaucoup plus succincte à travers des pages web telles qu'ils les partagent actuellement via leur site. Alors au niveau des défis, obstacles, opportunités, donc c'est sûr que il y a des problèmes de gouvernance et de compréhension commune. Je pense qu'on en a parlé ce matin. C'est aussi tout le problème de langage entre les différentes équipes, puisqu'il y a différents départements qui sont impliqués. On a tous notre jargon et des fois des mots qui veulent dire quelque chose pour les uns ne veulent pas dire la même chose pour les autres. Fait qu'il peut y avoir des quiproquos ou des mauvaises compréhensions. Donc c'est important de se baser sur un langage qui va être compris par tout le monde. Vu on a plusieurs donc départements entre la Bibliothèque nationale et les archives, pour nous, ce qui était important à l'informatique, c'était d'avoir une solution unique qui puisse répondre à tous les besoins. Le problème de l'argent, on en parle aussi depuis ce matin, donc on a du mal à faire face à ce projet avec nos budgets courant. Donc, on discute en ce moment avec le Conseil du Trésor pour aller chercher de l'argent qui serait dédié à ce projet-là. Ressources humaines, on en a beaucoup parlé avec le sondage. De notre côté, on n'a pas personne à temps plein sur ce projet-là pour l'instant. Malgré tout, on avance. Il y a aussi le problème de formation. Donc, c'est sûr qu'il faut que tout le monde arrive à avoir le même niveau de connaissance, qu'on puisse travailler ensemble. Bon, prise en charge, responsabilité des parties prenantes. Alors, on a aussi des défis. Pardon? Ok. On a des défis par rapport à tout ce qui est donc par rapport à la solution. Est-ce que c'est une solution d'infrastructure ou c'est une solution applicative Généralement, souvent, le réflexe, c'est de penser stockage, donc c'est de penser infrastructure, mais avec un système, si on veut avoir un système OIS, il ne faut pas oublier la partie applicative. La donnée versus le document, on est beaucoup plus habitué à gérer des documents, mais il y a tout ce qui est données de recherche, tout ce qui sont les données dans les bases de données aussi qu'on pourrait pouvoir nous déposer. Développement interne versus solution commerciale, on s'est beaucoup posé la question. Pour nous, pour l'instant, c'est vraiment un développement interne basé sur des solutions open source pour garder l'indépendance par rapport aux fournisseurs. Aussi, ce qui est vraiment important, souvent on pense que c'est une solution avant tout technologique. On en a quand même parlé aujourd'hui. Il y a toute la gouvernance et le soutien organisationnel d'un tel projet qui est important et qui se retrouve d'ailleurs très très bien expliqué dans les critères.
Je vous demanderai de conclure.
Oui,
s'il vous plaît.
j'arrive. C'est ça. Donc, BANQ, à travers son projet de dépôt numérique fiable, veut vraiment se positionner en rôle de leader. On discute en ce moment avec les ministères et organismes pour assurer essayer d'avoir une cohésion au niveau du workflow depuis la création du document de leur côté. Puis aussi, on veut établir des ponts avec d'autres partenaires là pour mener à bien notre projet. Merci.
Donc, je passe la parole à Fé.
No. Do I keep pressing or it'll come up? Oh, there it is. Okay. It's up there. Hi, my name is Faye LeMay. I'm the manager of digital preservation at Library and Archives Canada. And I'm going to talk to you today about some of the challenges and opportunities I think are unique to working at the national level. So I put a bit of an agenda up, which we don't need to go through. So the first thing I thought I would talk to you about are some of the challenges that I thought may be unique to working at a national level. The first thing is Library and Archives takes in material almost exclusively from outside of the organization. We get library material, we get records from government departments, and we get donations from private individuals. This material has a wide variety. We've got audiovisual, books, serials, maps, music, film, stamps, you name it, art, documentary art, we get it all. It comes in hundreds, if not thousands of formats, and it comes in multiple kinds of carriers. So we get hard drives, USB keys, 3.5-inch floppies, 5.25-inch floppies, we get it all. So there's a huge challenge in digital preservation dealing with all of that type of material. The scale at National and Library Archives is fairly, I consider it huge. Currently in my digital repository, I have 6.7 petabytes of material stored. We do 2 copies of that for a total about 13.4 petabytes stored. It's all put on LTO tape. I manage over 12,000 tapes to manage all of that, and I retrieve about 1 million digital objects a year out of the archive. So the scale on that is very huge and can be quite a challenge to manage. Because we're a fairly big organization, as much as I'd like to, I don't control the entire process from the time we acquire the material to the time it works its way to the digital preservation repository. There's a lot of people in Library and Archives involved in that process. So there are some challenges with us coordinating with our colleagues in getting that material from the point it's acquired at LAC all the way to digital preservation. I have a colleague coming up this afternoon that I work with on that. She's going to talk a little bit about her challenges with that. So that can be very challenging at a national organization. And of course, there's the organizational challenges that sort of surround all of that to sort of make it all work. So what did we do to sort of manage or to tackle that? We developed a digital preservation strategy. We had it signed off a year ago. It's up on our website. And it was designed by the digital preservation team from the bottom up, and it was approved it was brought all the way up to the top for approval. It is basically a step-by-step approach to get us to the point that we have a full-fledged, well-sustained, well-funded program for digital preservation in Library and Archives Canada. It is based on all the key ISO standards. So we fully adopted the OIS reference model. So we use that model to define the boundaries of the program. And then we're using ISO 16363, which is the Trusted Repository Accreditation and Certification criteria to help us drive the components we need to put in place to mature the digital preservation program at LAC. The key part of that is that strategy was approved all the way to the top of the organization and was approved by our management board. So it's an official strategy of LAC now. And we've also taken that strategy and we communicated it quite widely. We did a very large internal consultation on it. And we also brought it to our colleagues at BenQ. And we also brought it internationally. We brought it to London and Paris just after Christmas this year and consulted it widely. So we took those challenges, we turned it into an opportunity, and we created a strategy for digital preservation at LAC. The next slide here, and I won't go into too much detail because there's a lot on it. One of the key components of our strategy was to define our end state. So this is a diagram. It's not meant, don't try to read it. It's not meant to be read. It just shows that what we did is we defined the end state. We defined where we wanted to end up, and then we worked backwards and developed the steps we want to do to get there. The key parts of this to look at is we're looking at 4 major components. So we're looking at how do we resource the program? What are the technical solutions we need to support the program? What are the policies, plans, and practices we need to put in place for the program? And finally, how are we going to manage the collections that are stored within that repository? And then underneath each of those, we've set goals for each one of those components. And the whole strategy is trying to get us there. So there are also other opportunities that we're pursuing within LAC. One of the things that we've just recently acquired is Preservica. So we are currently testing Preservica as a digital preservation solution. The first phase of that, so out of all the wide variety of material that we have coming in, we're testing it with our published heritage folks. So we're testing it with the librarians at this point in time. We're going to test it from the point it's brought into LAC all the way till it makes it to our digital preservation repository. We've also recognized at the federal level, not just within LAC, but at the federal level, there are many other government departments besides ourselves that have digital preservation challenges. So what we've done is we've now put in place an interdepartmental working group to get together and try to solve major digital preservation issues at the federal level in the Government of Canada. I'm actively recruiting, looking to the left here. And the other thing that we do as well is we do a lot of collaboration with international colleagues. We find that because of the scale that we're at, we need to talk to people at the national level who have petabytes of data with the wide variety we do. So we find it very beneficial to work with people like the Digital Preservation Coalition and to meet regularly with people like the ULCC, Bibliothèque Nationale de France, etc. That's it.
Thank you very much. Je ne voudrais pas voler du temps à nos conférenciers, surtout à vous. Alors, on aurait une période d'environ 5 minutes pour toute question que vous voudriez adresser à nos panélistes. Yes.
First of all, I want to apologize for being ruthless, eventually just trying to keep us on track, and I know it feels terrible. I'm just wondering how much up and down happens. How familiar were you, particularly the regional and national levels, with each other, and how, and at a local level, how familiar are you with your regional offerings and so on? How's the information flow?
Well, we sit beside each other, so we're quite familiar with what each other. But I think that we're, if you're offering something at a regional level, but for individual institutions, of course, that there's constant, that is constant. And I think what's interesting and kind of encouraging is over probably the last 2 or 3 years, we've started to do a lot more like inter-regional stuff. So working fairly closely with Corey on a number of things like that type of stuff has started to develop. And then now with CRKN, Carl, that there does seem to be, flow.
Yeah, I mean, sort of generically, I would say like it's happening now, right? And it happens in events like this. And if that means, and I, speaking only personally, like I have felt actually since the Carl DPWG spun up, like I felt much more connected to what my colleagues at ANQ and LAC and places like that are doing, because it's a regular venue where we actually talk and have a conversation sort of about, hey, what are you doing, versus running into them at conferences like PASIG and places like that. So, I mean, if this can set a tone for later conversations just maybe about like, how do we keep this conversation going? Like, I actually think bringing this group or a group of people like this together regularly could be a good start for it.
Do you have any questions, comments? Yes.
Hi, I have a question for LAC. It was really interesting for me to hear more about your preservation efforts because I didn't know that much about them actually, and you're doing it at huge scale. So I just wonder if you see clear opportunities for the university sector and LAC to be working more closely together, or maybe there are very successful programs that I'm not aware of, but I'm just interested in the intersection between the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing. And it would be great if we can kind of share infrastructure or at least share best practices. So what opportunities do you think there might be there?
I think it's an area where there's a lot of opportunity because I don't think we've done a lot, to be honest with you. We've been so focused over the last couple of years of sort of maturing the digital preservation program at LAC. It was a fairly small program at first. We looked around and realized that there was a lot coming our way. Right now, we were only doing about 45 terabytes per month. We were only storing about 45 terabytes per month. I know it sounds, I'm saying only, I know. We ramped it up to about 100 to 120 terabytes per month. So we've been really focused on that over the last couple of years, just building the program. We wrote a policy on how to manage our holdings. We wrote the strategy. We've been investing in technology. We haven't really had a lot of time to sort of look up and around us because we've been so busy focusing on trying to get that fixed. Now with the strategy in place, we're starting to staff a bit more. We're getting some more people in. I think the time may be ripe now for us to start to work more closely with our colleagues within Canada. We first touched base with our international colleagues, mostly because we thought that's where we would find people at our scale. But you're right. I think there's a lot of potential there. It's one that we haven't really done a lot of work with, to be honest with you. Yeah.
We may have time for an additional question. Yes.
Hi. Digital curation and digital preservation have traditionally been thought of as two separate things. And I'm wondering, as you've developed maturity in your programs and the need to make content preservation ready as soon as it comes into the organization, if that's impacted how you do digital curation work.
I'll just blab while other people are thinking. I mean, I think that excuse me, I think the first thing to fall away will be the distinction between digital curation and curation in general. And I think that digital preservation activities are specific to the medium, but that curation activities are not specific to any medium, right? Outside of selection and scale and some of the other problems that have been touched on repeatedly today. That's what I would say, is that I think digital curation will be less of a concern and it'll just be subsumed into the larger conversation around curation.
I have a question about digital curation. When you say digital curation, are you talking about the end-to-end life cycle of a document as per the DCC, or are you talking about curation as to make accessible on the web or something?
The former.
So the full life cycle from creation all the way out to disposition. So you're talking about the DCC life cycle. So in LAC, we place digital preservation in the middle of the DCC. So if you look at the digital creation life cycle, it starts at creation, receive, then it goes to selection and appraisal, ingest, and out back to transform and out again. So when we developed our strategy, we placed digital preservation in the middle of that life cycle. If you look at the model, there's a big arrow that says preserve. We just took that chunk and we actually applied the OAS reference model to that part of the DCC. We overlapped the two. So as a result, if you open it up, by virtue of having digital preservation in the middle of it, you start to influence as people bring stuff in, and you start to influence as you start to bring people out. So that's how we did it at LAC. I should have brought a diagram to show you where it fits. It's hard to describe it with your hands, but we actually do have a diagram that shows that. So as I said, we opened it up and put digital preservation in the middle. Yeah.
So I would like to, on behalf of you, to thank our speakers. Et je pense que c'est une belle démonstration ce matin qu'on a voulu faire pour prouver et démontrer le dynamisme qu'il y a à travers les différentes institutions que nous représentons pour justement mettre des énergies à la préservation du patrimoine et de nos documents. Alors, je vous remercie infiniment.
That just leaves me to say it's lunchtime, and we'll start again at 1:30 promptly. Thanks.